Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip to clear my head after the divorce. I should have known something was wrong when Brandon Edwards showed up at my apartment that October morning with that strange gleam in his eyes, talking about getting back to nature and finding ourselves in the wilderness. Brandon had been my best friend since college, but lately he'd been different. Obsessed with survival shows, spending hours researching remote hiking trails and talking constantly about disconnecting from civilization. Still, I needed the distraction, and the idea of losing myself in the mountains for a few days seemed like exactly what my shattered life needed. The drive to the Nantahala took us through increasingly isolated mountain roads, past hand-painted signs warning about bear activity and cell phone dead zones. Brandon had insisted we take the most remote trail possible, the Hazel Creek Trail that wound deep into the wilderness near Fontana Lake, far from the popular tourist routes. "Trust me, Mike," he'd said, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles as we bounced down a dirt road barely wide enough for his Jeep. "This is going to change everything." By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the ancient oak and pine trees. The parking area was empty except for a single rusted pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in months. A weathered sign warned hikers about the dangers of traveling alone and the importance of registering with park services, but Brandon had waved it off. "Bureaucratic nonsense," he'd muttered, shouldering his oversized pack without filling out any of the required forms. The first hour of hiking passed normally enough. The trail wound through dense forest, following an old creek bed that gurgled and whispered in the growing darkness. Brandon maintained a punishing pace, barely stopping to rest despite the steep elevation gains. He kept checking his GPS device obsessively, muttering about coordinates and waypoints I couldn't understand. When I asked him about our destination, he just smiled that unsettling smile and said, "We'd know it when we saw it." As full darkness settled over the forest, we finally stopped to make camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering hemlocks. The silence was oppressive. No bird calls, no insect chirping, just the distant sound of wind through branches that sounded almost like whispered voices. Brandon immediately began setting up his tent with military precision, while I struggled with my own gear in the inadequate beam of my headlamp. "You feel that?" Brandon asked suddenly, straightening up from his work. "Feel what?" "The energy. This place has power, Mike. Ancient power." I looked around the clearing, noting how the trees seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater effect. There was something unsettling about the symmetry, as if the space had been deliberately arranged. "It's just a campsite, Brandon. A little creepy maybe, but not creepy. Sacred." His voice carried a reverence that made my skin crawl. The Cherokee used to perform rituals here, spiritual cleansings, sometimes darker things. I wanted to ask how he knew that, but something in his tone warned me off. Instead, I focused on getting our camp stove working, though the flame kept guttering out despite the lack of wind. It took 5 tries to get it stable enough to heat our dinner, and even then the blue flame flickered strangely, occasionally flaring green for no reason I could determine. We ate our dehydrated meals in relative silence, the only conversation consisting of Brandon's increasingly bizarre observations about the forest around us. He claimed to hear voices in the wind, insisted that shadows were moving independently of their sources, and kept turning his head to track sounds that I couldn't detect. When I suggested we get some sleep, he shook his head violently. "Not yet. We need to wait for the moon to set. That's when they're most active." When what's most active? But he'd already turned away, pulling out a small leather journal and scribbling notes by the light of his headlamp. The scratching of his pen on paper seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, and I caught glimpses of symbols that looked more like ancient pictographs than any language I recognized. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 11, leaving Brandon hunched over his journal like some deranged scholar. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every small sound seemed amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of what might have been an owl but sounded disturbingly human. Around midnight, I heard Brandon's tent zipper open and the soft crunch of his footsteps moving away from camp. "Brandon?" I called softly but received no response. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining to hear any sign of his return. The temperature seemed to be dropping rapidly, and my breath began to fog inside the tent despite the insulated sleeping bag. Worse than the cold was the growing sensation that something was watching our campsite, circling just beyond the range of visibility. I kept hearing branches breaking in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if something large was methodically working its way closer. When I finally gathered the courage to unzip my tent and peer outside, Brandon's tent stood empty, the entrance flap hanging open like a gaping mouth. His sleeping bag was unzipped from the inside, but there was no sign of where he'd gone. Our campfire had died down to barely glowing embers, casting strange shadows that seemed to writhe and dance with malevolent life. "Brandon," I called louder, not caring what might hear me. "Where are you?" The forest swallowed my voice without even an echo in response. I spent the rest of the night sitting just inside my tent entrance, clutching my emergency whistle and flashlight, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, gray and sickly through the canopy, I emerged to find our campsite subtly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Our food bag hung exactly where we'd left it, but the contents had somehow rotted overnight. Canned goods bulging with botulism, dried fruits covered in fuzzy mold, energy bars crumbling with decay. The smell was overwhelming, like meat left in the sun for weeks. Brandon's journal lay open beside the dead fire, its pages filled with increasingly frantic scribblings in multiple handwritings, as if different people had been using the same pen. The entries started normally enough, observations about plant life and weather conditions, but quickly devolved into rambling passages about the hunger that walks and feeding the ancient need. The final entry, written in a shaking hand that barely resembled Brandon's usual neat script, simply read, "It's beautiful when you stop fighting it." I shouted his name until my throat was raw, then spent the morning methodically searching the area around our campsite. The forest seemed determined to confuse me. Paths that had been clear the night before now ended in impenetrable thickets, and my compass spun wildly no matter which direction I faced. My GPS device showed only error messages, and my cell phone had lost all signal despite showing full bars when we'd arrived. By noon, I was starting to panic. I knew the basics of wilderness survival, but I also knew that staying in one place was usually the best strategy when someone was lost. The problem was that I wasn't sure if Brandon was lost or if something else had happened to him. The journal entries suggested a mental breakdown, but they were written in too many different hands to all be his work. I was gathering firewood when I heard him calling my name from somewhere deeper in the forest. The voice was definitely Brandon's, but there was something off about the tone. Too cheerful, too sing-song, like a child playing a game. "Mike! Oh, Mike! Come see what I found!" I followed the voice deeper into the trees, pushing through undergrowth that seemed determined to snag my clothes and scratch my skin. The forest grew denser and darker as I went, until I could barely see the sky through the canopy. The air became thick and humid, carrying scents of decomposition and something else, something wild and predatory that made every instinct scream at me to run. I found Brandon in a small grove where the trees formed a perfect circle, their trunks twisted into spiral patterns that hurt to look at directly. He was sitting cross-legged in the center, completely naked, his skin pale and waxy in the filtered light. When he turned to look at me, his smile was too wide, stretching his lips beyond what seemed anatomically possible. "There you are," he said, his voice maintaining that disturbing cheerfulness. I was starting to think you weren't coming." "Jesus Christ, Brandon, what happened to your clothes? Are you hurt?" I approached cautiously, noting that his skin seemed to have a grayish pallor and his fingernails had grown several inches overnight, forming curved talons that he kept flexing rhythmically. "Hurt?" He tilted his head at an impossible angle, like an owl. "Oh no, Mike, I've never felt better. I've been fed." "Fed? What are you talking about?" I was close enough now to see that his eyes had changed color from brown to an unsettling pale yellow, and his pupils had contracted to thin vertical slits. "By the Wendigo, Mike. It's been waiting here for so long, sleeping in the hungry spaces between the trees. But I woke it up. I offered myself, and it accepted." His voice was changing as he spoke, becoming deeper and more guttural with each word. I knew enough Cherokee folklore to recognize the name, and the knowledge hit me like ice water in my veins. Wendigo, the cannibalistic creature of Native American legend, born from humans who resorted to eating human flesh during times of starvation. According to the stories, once the transformation began, the person became an insatiable predator, forever hungry for human meat. "Brandon, you're scaring me. Let's get back to camp and figure this out. Maybe you hit your head or—" "I can smell your fear," he interrupted, rising to his feet with fluid grace that was entirely wrong for a human body. "It's delicious, almost as delicious as you're going to taste." I stumbled backward as he began to change before my eyes. His limbs elongated, stretching like taffy until he stood nearly 8 feet tall. His skin took on a mottled gray-green color, and coarse black hair sprouted from his arms and chest. His face was the worst part, still recognizably Brandon, but stretched and distorted, with a mouth full of yellowed fangs and those terrible predator eyes that never blinked. "Brandon, fight it!" I screamed, pulling out my emergency whistle and blowing it as hard as I could. "I know you're still in there." The creature that had been my best friend threw back its head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the howl of a dying animal. "Brandon is still here, Mike. He's just quieter now. But he remembers you. He remembers how much he cares about you. That's why he wants to share this gift." It began stalking toward me with deliberate slowness, savoring my terror. Its movements were both graceful and wrong, like a spider pretending to be human. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth with no thought for direction or strategy, just pure animal panic driving me forward. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, but moving with that same terrible deliberate pace. It was playing with me, I realized, the way a cat plays with a mouse before killing it. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But the primal part that had kept humans alive for millennia knew exactly what was hunting me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a fallen log in a desperate attempt to hide. The forest had gone completely silent again. No bird songs, no insect noises, even the wind had died. In that unnatural quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the ragged wheeze of my breathing. Then I heard Brandon's voice again, closer than it should have been. "Mike? Where are you, buddy? I just want to talk." The voice was coming from directly above me. I looked up through the branches of the fallen tree and saw the thing crouched on a thick limb not 20 feet away, its yellow eyes scanning the forest floor. It had moved through the canopy like some kind of nightmare monkey, and now it was hunting me from above. "I know you're down there," it continued in Brandon's voice. "I can smell your sweat, your fear, your delicious warm blood pumping through those soft human veins." I pressed myself deeper into the rotting leaves beneath the log, trying to become invisible. A fat centipede crawled across my hand, but I didn't dare move to brush it away. Above me, the creature was sniffing the air like a bloodhound, its head moving back and forth with mechanical precision. "You know what the funny thing is, Mike?" The voice was conversational now, almost friendly. "Brandon really did care about you. That's why I chose him. The hunger is so much more satisfying when it comes wrapped in love. It dropped from the branch and landed no more than 10 feet from my hiding spot. Through the gaps in the rotting wood, I could see its feet, which were no longer feet at all, but elongated claws that dug furrows in the soft earth with each step. He's been planning this trip for months, Mike, ever since he found that old Cherokee site on one of his solo hikes. He knew what lived here, and he knew it was hungry. He brought you here as an offering, Mike, a sacrifice to feed the ancient hunger. The words hit me harder than any physical blow. All those late-night conversations about getting back to nature, all his insistence on finding the most remote location possible, it had all been a setup. My best friend had deliberately led me to this place to be consumed by something that should only exist in folklore and nightmares. But here's the beautiful part, the creature continued, beginning to circle my hiding spot like a predator testing its prey's defenses. I don't think he consciously knew what he was doing. The hunger called to him first, you see, planted the ideas, the compulsions, made him want to seek out this place and bring fresh meat. He thought he was just planning a camping trip. I could see its legs now as it paced back and forth, the elongated limbs moving with that same wrong articulation that made my mind rebel against what I was seeing. The skin was covered in a fine coating of dark fur, and I could smell the musk of wild animal mixed with something else, the sweet, cloying scent of corruption. The hunger is patient. Mike. It's been waiting in these mountains for decades, feeding on the occasional hiker who strayed too far from the marked trails. But it was getting weaker, you see? Hungrier. It needed something more substantial. Someone with strong social connections who could lure in fresh prey without arousing suspicion. The pacing stopped directly in front of my hiding spot. I could see its claws digging into the earth just inches from my face, and I had to bite my lip to keep from whimpering in terror. Brandon fought it at first, you know. When the transformation began, there was a moment when he almost broke free. He was screaming your name, trying to warn you. But the hunger is so much stronger than human will. So much more honest than human morality. One of those terrible claws reached down and began probing at the edge of the fallen log, testing its stability. I knew my hiding spot had been compromised, but I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or think clearly. The thing is, Mike, I really don't want to hurt you. Not in the way you're thinking. The hunger isn't cruel, it's just necessary. Like breathing or sleeping. And once you understand that, once you stop fighting it, the process is actually quite beautiful. The log shifted as the creature began to lift it with inhuman strength. I scrambled backward like a crab, finally breaking free of my paralysis. But there was nowhere to go. The thing that had been Brandon stood to its full height, the log held casually in one massive hand like a piece of driftwood. "There you are," it said with that horrible parody of Brandon's voice. "I was starting to worry you'd run off and gotten yourself lost." I tried to run again, but my legs had turned to jelly and I only managed a few stumbling steps before falling face first into the forest floor. The taste of dirt and rotting leaves filled my mouth as I rolled over to face my approaching doom. The creature loomed over me, its yellow eyes reflecting what little light filtered through the canopy. This close, I could see that patches of Brandon's original skin still remained, stretched tight over the elongated skull like a mask that no longer fit properly. The human parts were somehow more horrifying than the monstrous ones, reminders that something I had loved and trusted was still trapped somewhere inside this nightmare. "Brandon," I whispered, surprised that I could still speak. "If you're still in there, please fight this. Please remember who you used to be." The creature paused, tilting its head with that same owl-like motion. For just a moment, something flickered in those yellow eyes, a flash of brown that might have been human consciousness struggling to the surface. "Mike?" The voice was different now, smaller and more confused. "Mike, what's happening to me? I can't control it. The hunger is so strong and I'm so hungry." "Fight it, Brandon. You're stronger than this thing. Remember college? Remember Sarah? Remember all those late nights talking about our dreams and fears? The creature, Brandon, doubled over as if in physical pain, clutching its elongated head with those terrible claws. It hurts, Mike. Fighting it hurts so much. It would be so easy to just give in, to feed. Don't you dare, I said, forcing myself to stand despite my shaking legs. Don't you dare give up on yourself. On us. For a long moment we stood frozen in that tableau, the monster and its intended prey, connected by years of friendship and the desperate hope that love might be stronger than supernatural hunger. I could see Brandon warring with himself, human consciousness battling against an alien intelligence that had invaded his mind and body. Then the moment passed, and the yellow eyes returned with doubled intensity. "Thank you, Mike," the creature said in its horrible hybrid voice. "Brandon says goodbye. He says he's sorry for what happens next." It lunged at me with inhuman speed, but adrenaline finally kicked in and I threw myself sideways, narrowly avoiding the rake of its claws. I felt them pass close enough to tear holes in my jacket, and the brief touch of those talons was like ice water against my skin. I ran with everything I had, no longer caring about stealth or strategy. The creature followed, but something had changed in its pursuit. It was no longer playing with me. Whatever internal struggle had just taken place had cost it something, made it more desperate and less controlled. Trees whipped past in a blur as I crashed through the undergrowth, following what might have been a game trail toward what I hoped was lower elevation. Behind me, I could hear the thing following through the canopy, branches snapping under its weight as it swung from tree to tree like some nightmare ape. I burst out of the tree line onto what looked like an old logging road, overgrown but still passable. The partial sunlight felt like salvation after the oppressive darkness of the deep forest, and I could see what looked like tire tracks in the mud, proof that other humans had been here recently. The creature dropped down behind me with a crash that shook the ground, and I got my first clear look at what Brandon had become in full sunlight. It was worse than I had imagined. Nearly 9 feet tall now, covered in a mixture of human skin and coarse black fur, with limbs that bent at wrong angles and a face that was a horrible fusion of man and predator. "You can't escape the hunger. Mike," it said, advancing slowly down the logging road. "It's patient. It's eternal. And now that it's tasted your fear, it will never stop hunting you." I backed away, looking desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon. My hand closed on a fallen branch about the size of a baseball bat, its end jagged where it had broken off from the parent tree. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "Come on then," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "Let's finish this." The creature smiled with too many teeth and charged. I swung the branch with everything I had, connecting with its skull in a blow that would have killed a normal human. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms and the branch exploded into splinters, but the creature barely staggered. It backhanded me almost casually, and I felt ribs crack as I flew through the air and hit a tree trunk hard enough to see stars. As I struggled to breathe through the pain, the creature stalked closer, savoring the moment. The Cherokee who used to live here understood the truth, Mike. They knew that hunger is the most fundamental force in nature, more basic than love, more honest than compassion. They fed the Wendigo willingly, understanding that some appetites must be satisfied. It knelt beside my broken body, one clawed hand reaching out to caress my face with grotesque tenderness. "Brandon wants you to know that this isn't personal. He still loves you. We both do, in our own ways." Through my fading vision, I saw the creature's mouth opening wider than any human jaw should be able to stretch, revealing rows of yellowed fangs designed for tearing flesh from bone. This was it. This was how I was going to die, consumed by my best friend in the middle of nowhere, with no one to even know what had happened to us. That's when I heard the sound of a diesel engine growing louder on the logging road. The creature's head snapped up, its predator instincts alert to the approaching threat. A massive logging truck was grinding up the mountain road, its driver clearly visible in the cab. The Wendigo hesitated, some remaining trace of Brandon's human intelligence warning it about being seen in daylight by witnesses. I used that moment of distraction to roll away and struggled to my feet, one arm hanging useless at my side. The truck was still 100 yards away, but I could see the driver's face clearly now. A middle-aged man with a beard, probably just doing his job and having no idea he was about to encounter something out of folklore. "Help!" I screamed with what little breath I had left. "Help me!" The creature snarled in frustration, caught between its hunger and its need to remain hidden. The truck was getting closer, and the driver had clearly seen me. He was already slowing down and reaching for what looked like a radio. "This isn't over, Mike," the creature said in Brandon's voice. "The hunger knows where you live now. It knows your scent. It will find you again." Then it turned and loped back into the tree line, moving with that horrible fluid grace until it disappeared into the shadows between the trees. The logging truck pulled up beside me, and the driver jumped out, a burly man in flannel who took one look at my condition and immediately began calling for emergency services on his radio. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out as incoherent rambling about monsters and friends who weren't human anymore. "Easy there, son," the driver said, helping me into his cab. "Looks like you've had a hell of a time out here. Bear attack, maybe? We'll get you to a hospital and get this sorted out." I didn't correct him. How could I? Who would believe the truth? The rescue took 4 hours, with search and rescue teams combing the forest for any sign of Brandon. They found our campsite, along with his journal, but no trace of Brandon himself. The official report listed him as missing and presumed dead, probably the victim of a bear attack that had also injured me. The journal was dismissed as the product of a mind under extreme stress, and I was strongly encouraged to seek counseling for survivors' guilt and trauma. I never told them what really happened in those woods. I never told them about the creature that had been my best friend, or about the hunger that walks between the trees in the remote places of the world. They wouldn't have believed me anyway, and part of me hoped that by staying silent, I might somehow convince myself that it had all been a hallucination brought on by hypothermia and terror. But I know the truth. Brandon is still out there somewhere, transformed into something that should only exist in nightmares, carrying an insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment, I think I can hear him calling my name in that horrible sing-song voice, promising that the hunger is patient and that he'll never stop looking for me. The doctors say my ribs healed cleanly and that I should make a full recovery. They don't understand why I refuse to go camping anymore, or why I keep all my curtains closed after dark, or why I wake up screaming from dreams of yellow eyes and too many teeth. They don't understand that some hungers never die, and that somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina, something that used to be human is still waiting for me to return to the wild places where civilization holds no power and the ancient appetites still rule the darkness between the trees. The Cherokee were right about one thing: some hungers must be fed. I just pray that I never again become the meal. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness around Grandfather Mountain, North Carolina, 3 months ago. I still wake up screaming some nights, and I can't look at raw meat without my hands shaking. The doctors say it's trauma, but they don't understand. They weren't there. They didn't see what David became. David Jones and I had been friends since college, bound together by our shared love of the outdoors and our mutual need to escape the suffocating corporate world we'd found ourselves trapped in. When David suggested we take a week-long hiking trip through the Nantahala National Forest, I jumped at the chance. We both needed to disconnect, to find something real again among the ancient mountains of western North Carolina. The plan was simple: park at the Grandfather Mountain trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry where few tourists ventured, and spend 5 days completely off-grid. No phones, no GPS devices, just topographical maps, a compass, and our wits. David had been obsessing over the trip for months, poring over maps of the most remote sections where old Cherokee hunting trails still cut through valleys that hadn't seen human footsteps in decades. "Look at this," David had said, spreading the worn topographical map across my kitchen table 2 weeks before we left. His finger traced a thin line that seemed to disappear into white space. Lost Creek Valley. The trail markers stop here, see? It's like the forest just swallows everything. I should have paid more attention to the way his eyes lingered on that blank space, the hunger in his voice when he talked about places where civilization couldn't reach. But I was caught up in my own excitement, my own desperate need to escape. We set out on a gray October morning when the mountains were already touched with frost. The drive to Grandfather Mountain took 4 hours, winding through increasingly remote roads until we reached the trailhead parking lot, a small gravel clearing that felt like the edge of the world. Only 2 other cars sat in the lot, both covered with a thin layer of yellow leaves. "Perfect," David said, shouldering his pack. "Looks like we'll have the wilderness to ourselves." The first day's hike was everything I'd hoped for. We followed the established trail for 6 miles, climbing steadily through hardwood forests painted in brilliant reds and golds. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and the sharp bite of coming winter. My legs burned from the climb, but it was a good burn, the kind that reminded me I was alive. We made camp that first night beside a small creek, the sound of running water masking any noise from the outside world. David was in his element, moving with practiced efficiency as he set up his tent and started a fire. I watched him work, noting how his movements seemed almost ritualistic, how he kept glancing toward the deeper forest as if he were listening for something. "You hear that?" he asked suddenly, freezing in the middle of hanging his food bag. I stopped sorting through my gear and listened. The creek gurgled nearby, leaves rustled in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. "Hear what?" "Nothing," he said after a moment, but his voice carried an odd disappointment. "Just thought I heard. Never mind." That night I dreamed of running through dark trees, my feet finding paths I'd never walked before. In the dream, something was calling my name from deep in the forest, a voice that sounded like wind through bare branches. I woke before dawn with the taste of copper in my mouth and the strange sensation that I'd been somewhere else entirely. David was already awake, sitting by the dead fire and staring into the forest. His face looked gaunt in the pre-dawn light, his eyes sunken and bright. "Sleep well?" I asked, crawling out of my tent. He turned to me slowly, as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Did you dream about them?" "About who?" "The old ones, the hungry ones." His voice was barely above a whisper. "They used to hunt these mountains, you know. Before the Cherokee, before anyone. They're still here, waiting in the deep places." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "David, what are you talking about?" He blinked and suddenly his expression cleared. "Sorry, man. Weird dreams. Must be the altitude or something." He stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. "Ready to get deeper into the real wilderness?" The second day, we left the established trail behind. David led us down an old deer path that wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees here were older, their trunks massive and twisted, their canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained dim and shadowed. The sound of our footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the moss-covered ground. "According to the map, Lost Creek Valley should be just over that ridge," David said, pointing to a steep slope ahead of us. "No one's mapped the interior. We'll be walking where maybe a dozen people have been in the last century." The climb was brutal. The deer path petered out halfway up, forcing us to bushwhack through thick underbrush that seemed to grab at our packs and clothing. Thorns caught my arms, leaving thin lines of blood, and more than once I had to pause to untangle myself from vines that seemed to writhe around my legs. David, however, moved through the forest like he belonged there. He never seemed to catch on branches, never lost his footing on the loose rocks. When I called for a rest break, he would turn back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Impatience mixed with something else. Pity, maybe. "Come on, Mike," he said during one of my breaks. "We're almost there. Can't you feel it?" I wiped sweat from my forehead and looked around at the oppressive forest surrounding us. Feel what? The emptiness. The space between things. It's like the forest is holding its breath. He was right, though I couldn't have put it into words myself. There was something wrong with this place, something that made my skin crawl and my heart race. The silence was too complete. No bird songs, no insect buzz. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the leaves above us. We crested the ridge as the sun was beginning to set, and Lost Creek Valley spread out below us like a bowl carved from the earth itself. The valley was deeper than I'd expected, its sides steep and rocky, covered with trees so old and tall they seemed to pierce the sky. At the bottom, I could just make out the silver thread of the creek David had named our destination. "Jesus," I breathed. "It's like looking into prehistory." David stood beside me, his breathing heavy and excited. "No one knows what's down there," he said. "No one's ever mapped it completely. There could be anything. Caves, ruins, bones from animals that died out centuries ago." "Or nothing," I said, trying to inject some sanity into the conversation. "It's probably just trees and rocks, David." He turned to look at me, and for a moment, his eyes reflected the dying light like an animal's. "You don't understand yet," he said, "but you will." The descent into the valley took longer than expected. The slope was treacherous, covered with loose rocks and hidden drops, and darkness fell while we were still picking our way down through the trees. By the time we reached the valley floor, we were using our headlamps and stumbling over roots and fallen logs. "We need to make camp," I said, exhaustion making my voice rough. "I can barely see my feet." "Just a little further," David said. "I want to find the creek." But when we found the creek, something was wrong with it. The water that should have been clear mountain runoff was dark and viscous, moving sluggishly between banks covered with what looked like black moss. The smell rising from it was organic and rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. "That's not right," I said, shining my light up and down the waterway. "Mountain streams don't look like that." David knelt beside the water and cupped some in his hands. In the beam of my headlamp, the liquid looked almost black, with an oily sheen that reflected rainbow colors. "David, don't—" He brought the water to his lips and drank. "My God, what are you doing?" I grabbed his shoulder, but he shrugged me off with surprising strength. "It tastes like iron," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Like blood and earth and things that have been sleeping for a very long time." I stared at him in horror. "David, that water could be contaminated. You could get seriously sick." He stood slowly, his movements fluid and predatory. "I feel fine, Mike. Better than fine. I feel awake." We made camp 50 yards from the creek, though I could barely bring myself to drink from my own water bottles knowing that polluted stream was so close. David set up his tent with mechanical precision, not speaking, his movements sharp and economical. When I tried to start a conversation about our route for the next day, he just stared at me with those two bright eyes until I gave up and crawled into my sleeping bag. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the valley. There were no normal forest noises, no owls, no rustling small animals, no wind through the leaves. Instead, there was something else. A low sound, almost below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to come from the earth itself. A rumbling, hungry sound that made my teeth ache. Sometime after midnight, I heard David's tent zipper open. I lay perfectly still, listening to his footsteps on the soft ground. They moved away from camp, toward the creek, but they didn't sound quite right. The rhythm was off, and there seemed to be too many of them, as if he were taking extra steps between each normal stride. After what felt like hours, the footsteps returned. I heard his tent zipper again, and then silence. In the morning, David was gone. I woke to pale gray light filtering through the canopy and the sound of my own breathing. David's tent was still there, But when I called his name, there was no answer. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and walked over to his tent, calling softly. "David, you okay, man?" I unzipped his tent flap and looked inside. His sleeping bag was there, unzipped from the inside, but David was nowhere to be seen. His pack was still there, his clothes, his boots, but David himself had vanished. "David!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the valley walls. "David!" Nothing, not even an echo that sounded right. I spent the entire day searching for him. I followed the creek in both directions, calling his name until my throat was raw. I climbed partway up the valley walls, looking for any sign of where he might have gone. I found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no dropped items. It was as if he had simply evaporated. As the sun began to set on the second day, panic started to claw at my chest. David had been my guide, the one with the maps and the experience. I was lost in a valley that didn't appear on any official charts, and my best friend had vanished without a trace. I was building up the fire and trying to figure out how I was going to navigate back to civilization when I heard footsteps approaching through the trees. "David," I called out, relief flooding through me. "Jesus, man, where have you been? I've been looking for you all day." The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of firelight. "David," I said again, more quietly. He stepped into the light, and my relief turned to ice in my veins. It was David. Same height, same build, same sandy brown hair. But something was fundamentally wrong. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface, creating web-like patterns across his face and arms. His eyes, which had always been a warm brown, were now pale yellow with pupils that reflected the firelight like a cat's. But it was his smile that made my blood freeze. His lips had pulled back to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that hurt my ears, as if multiple people were talking at once. "Hello, Mike," he said, and saliva dripped from between those terrible teeth. "I found them, the hungry ones. They've been waiting so long for fresh meat." I stumbled backward from the fire, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife on my belt. "What happened to you? What did you do?" "I drank from the source," David said, taking a slow step forward. "I let them in. Do you know how long they've been trapped in this valley, Mike? How many years they've been starving?" His joints made wet popping sounds as he moved, as if his bones were no longer properly connected. His head tilted to one side at an angle that should have been impossible. "Centuries, Mike. They've been waiting for someone to open the door, to give them flesh again. And you." He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. "You smell so good, so warm and alive and full of blood." I drew my knife, the blade catching the firelight. "Stay back, David. This isn't you. Something's controlling you." He laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass mixed with rushing wind. David let us in willingly. He wanted the emptiness, the hunger. He fed it to us piece by piece, memory by memory, until there was nothing left but appetite. The thing that had been my friend began to circle the fire, its movements fluid and wrong. Its feet didn't quite touch the ground, and when it passed between me and the flames, I could see through it, as if it were only partially there. "We know you, Mike," it said, those yellow eyes never leaving mine. David shared his memories. "We know about your sister." My blood turned to ice. "Don't." "The car accident when you were 17, how you were driving, how you lived and she didn't, how you've carried that guilt ever since, fed it, nurtured it, let it eat you alive from the inside." "Shut up." My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. "We can take that pain away," it continued, moving closer. "We can eat the guilt, swallow the shame. All you have to do is drink from the creek. Let us in. Join us." I tried to back away, but my legs hit a fallen log and I sprawled backward onto the ground. The David thing was on me in an instant, its weight pressing down on my chest, those terrible teeth inches from my throat. "You want the pain to stop," it whispered, its breath like rotting meat. You've wanted it to stop for 11 years. We can end it all, Mike. We can make you empty like David." Its claws. When had David grown claws? Dug into my shoulders, drawing blood. The smell of iron filled the air, and the thing's pupils dilated with hunger. I drove the knife up into its chest. The blade went in easily, too easily, as if I were stabbing mist. The thing on top of me didn't flinch, didn't cry out. Instead, it smiled wider, and I felt something cold and wet start to pour from the wound. Not blood, but something darker, something that seemed to absorb light. "Metal can't hurt us," it said. "We're not really here, Mike. We're in the spaces between things, in the emptiness that lives inside hunger itself." But as the dark liquid poured from the wound, I noticed something else. The David thing was becoming more solid, more real. The substance flowing from its chest seemed to be some kind of ethereal blood, and losing it was making the creature vulnerable. I twisted the knife and pulled it free, then stabbed again, this time aiming for the throat. More of the dark liquid spilled out, hissing where it hit the ground and leaving burn marks in the earth. The creature's weight suddenly became real and heavy. It gasped, a sound that was recognizably David's voice, and rolled off me, clutching at the wounds. "Mike," it said, and for a moment the voice was completely human. "Mike, what's happening to me?" I looked down at my friend's face and saw genuine confusion there, human terror replacing the predatory hunger. His eyes had returned to their normal brown, and the shark-like teeth had receded. "David," I breathed, "fight it. Whatever's in you, fight it." He looked down at his hands, which were covered in the dark liquid. "I can't remember," he said, his voice breaking. "I went to the creek, and then nothing. There's nothing inside me, Mike. They ate everything." His face contorted in pain, and when he looked up at me again, the yellow eyes were back. "But I'm still so hungry," he said, and lunged for my throat. This time, I was ready. I rolled to the side and came up with a burning log from the fire. When I swung it at David's head, the flames caught his hair and skin, and he screamed, a sound that was human and inhuman at the same time. Fire. The creatures were vulnerable to fire. I grabbed another burning branch and advanced on the David thing as it rolled on the ground, trying to extinguish the flames that were spreading across its body. The smell was terrible. Not like burning hair and flesh, but like sulfur and rotting eggs. "Mike, please," it cried, its voice shifting between David's familiar tones and something else, something that sounded like the wind through a graveyard. "Help me." I hesitated, the burning branch trembling in my hands. Part of me, the part that had been David's friend for 10 years, wanted to help, wanted to save him somehow. But the larger part, the part that recognized the intelligence lurking behind those yellow eyes, knew that David was already gone. "I'm sorry," I whispered and drove the burning log into the creature's chest. It screamed once more, a sound that shattered the unnatural silence of the valley and sent birds exploding from trees that I hadn't realized were there. The flames spread quickly, consuming the David thing until it was nothing but fire and smoke and the sound of something inhuman dying. When the flames finally died down, nothing remained but a pile of ash that the wind immediately began to scatter. I spent the rest of the night feeding the fire and listening to sounds moving through the forest around me. They were out there. More of them, the hungry ones that David had spoken of. I could hear them whispering to each other in voices like rustling leaves, could see their pale forms moving between the trees just outside the circle of firelight. But they didn't approach. The fire kept them at bay, and as long as I kept feeding it, I was safe. Dawn seemed to take forever to arrive, but when the first gray light began to penetrate the valley, the whispers stopped and the pale shapes melted back into the deeper forest. I packed my gear with shaking hands, scattered the fire, and began the climb out of Lost Creek Valley. The ascent was even more difficult than the descent had been. Without David to lead the way, I had to rely on my compass and my memory of the route we'd taken down. Several times I took wrong turns that led to dead ends or impassable cliff faces. The valley seemed to be fighting my attempts to leave, shifting and changing when I wasn't looking directly at it. But eventually, after what felt like hours of desperate climbing, I reached the ridge. I turned back once to look down into Lost Creek Valley, and for a moment, I could swear I saw figures standing by the dark creek, dozens of them, pale and hungry and waiting for the next traveler to find their way into that cursed place. The hike back to the trailhead took me 2 days. I got lost twice and had to spend a night in the open, but eventually I found the main trail and followed it back to civilization. By the time I reached my car, I was dehydrated, exhausted, and beginning to doubt my own memories of what had happened in the valley. I called the authorities, of course, reported David missing, organized search parties, led them back toward the area where we'd camped, but I could never find Lost Creek Valley again. The searchers found no trace of the dark creek, no sign that David had ever been there. According to the topographical maps the rescue teams brought, the area was just ordinary forest. No valleys, no hidden waterways, no blank spaces where ancient things might hide. They found David's body 3 weeks later, miles away from where we'd been camping. The official cause of death was exposure and animal attack. The medical examiner noted that parts of the body appeared to have been consumed, but attributed that to scavengers. I never told anyone about the creatures, about what David became, about the thing that wore his face and spoke with his voice. Who would believe me? I barely believe it myself most days. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that valley and the hungry things that live there. I think about the dark creek and the emptiness that calls to people who carry too much pain, too much guilt, too much shame, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can swear I hear David's voice calling to me from the darkness, inviting me to come back, to drink from the source, to let the hungry ones take away all the parts of myself that hurt. On those nights, I sleep with every light in the house burning, and I count the hours until dawn. The doctors say I'm healing, that the trauma will fade with time, but they don't understand that some things can't be healed, can't be forgotten. They don't understand that I left part of myself in that valley and that something else followed me home. Every morning I check my reflection carefully, looking for signs. Gray pallor, dark veins beneath the skin, eyes that reflect light in ways they shouldn't. So far, I look normal, human, but I remember the taste of iron in my mouth that first morning when I woke up from those strange dreams. I remember the hunger that gnawed at me during those long hours searching for David, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. And I remember how good the raw hamburger tasted last week when I was cooking dinner, how I stood in my kitchen and ate handful after handful of ground beef while it was still cold and red and bleeding. The hunger is growing, and I know that someday soon, I'll have to go back to Lost Creek Valley, back to the dark creek and the hungry ones who are waiting for me with infinite patience. After all, David shared his memories with them. They know about my sister, about the guilt that's been eating me alive for 11 years. They know I'm already half empty inside. They know I want the pain to stop. And when I finally can't resist anymore, when the hunger becomes too much to bear, I'll drive back to Grandfather Mountain. I'll hike into the wilderness, deeper than any map shows, until I find that valley again. I'll kneel by the dark creek and cup that iron-tasting water in my hands. And I'll drink. The hungry ones are patient. They've been waiting for centuries. They can wait a little longer for me to come home. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina, near the abandoned settlement of Lost Cove, where the old logging roads wind through valleys that maps forget to include. I should have listened to the ranger at the Cradle of Forestry Visitor Center when she hesitated before stamping our backcountry permit. Her weathered face had creased with something deeper than concern when Marcus spread our topographic map across her desk, pointing to the section of trail that would take us into the heart of the Joyce-Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness. "You boys sure about heading up past Hangover Lead?" she'd asked, her finger tracing the elevation lines. "Weather's been strange this season. Folks been getting turned around up there. Marcus had laughed, that easy, confident laugh that made him such a natural leader in our accounting firm. "We've done harder trails than this, ma'am. We're prepared." But I'd caught the look in her eyes, the way they lingered on the map's blank spaces between the marked trails. There were stories in those gaps, stories she wasn't telling. That was 3 days ago. Now, as I write this by the dying light of our campfire, my hands shaking so badly I can barely hold the pen, I know she was trying to warn us about more than just the weather. Our group had been planning this trip for months. Marcus Webb, our unofficial leader, had insisted we needed to disconnect from the digital world after our firm's brutal tax season. Besides Marcus, there was Derek Phillips, the quiet one who knew more about wilderness survival than the rest of us combined, and Tony Garcia, whose constant jokes usually kept our spirits up. We'd been friends since college, made it through internships, bad breakups, and career changes together. We trusted each other completely. The first day had been perfect. We'd hiked 8 miles along the well-marked Slick Rock Creek Trail, our boots finding easy purchase on the worn path. The October air was crisp but not cold, and the changing leaves created a cathedral of gold and crimson above us. Derek had spotted deer tracks near a creek crossing, and Tony had managed to catch a decent-sized trout for dinner. We'd made camp in a designated spot following all the leave-no-trace principles Derek had drilled into us. But the second day, things began to feel different. We'd left the main trail to follow an old logging road that showed on our 1987 topographic map, but seemed to exist only as a suggestion on the ground. Brambles and saplings had reclaimed most of it, and several times we had to stop and scout ahead to make sure we were still following the right path. Our GPS units kept losing signal, showing our location jumping erratically across the screen before giving up entirely. "Cell towers must be blocked by the ridgeline," Marcus had said, but his voice carried less certainty than usual. The forest felt wrong that second day. Too quiet. In 30-plus years of hiking, Derek had never experienced woods so devoid of bird calls. No squirrels chattered in the trees, no insects buzzed around our heads. Even our own footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by the moss and fallen leaves in a way that made our conversations feel like whispers in a vast, empty church. We'd made camp that night in a small clearing beside what our map labeled as Hunger Creek, though the waterway was barely more than a trickle between moss-covered rocks. The name felt appropriate. The creek seemed starved, desperate, clinging to life in the shadow of the surrounding ridges. I remember Tony trying to lighten the mood around the campfire, telling us about his disastrous attempt at online dating. But his usual animated gestures felt forced. We all felt it, that sense of being watched from the tree line, though none of us wanted to be the first to say it. Derek had been restless that night, getting up multiple times to check our bear hang and peer into the darkness beyond our fire's reach. "Just making sure our food's secure," he'd said, but I'd seen him examining the ground around our campsite with his flashlight, his brow furrowed in concentration. The third morning brought fog so thick we could barely see 10 feet in any direction. It clung to the valley like something alive, reluctant to burn off even as the sun climbed higher. We'd planned to hike to the summit of Hangover Lead, but Derek suggested we wait for the fog to clear. "Visibility's too poor," he'd said, though I noticed he kept glancing at something beyond our campsite. "Easy to get turned around in conditions like this." So we'd stayed put, playing cards and sharing stories until the fog finally began to dissipate around noon. That's when Derek found the tracks. They were just outside our campsite, in a patch of soft earth near the creek. At first glance, they looked almost human, the right size and general shape, but something about them was fundamentally wrong. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks. The gait was strange too, sometimes showing a normal walking pattern, other times revealing a stride so long it suggested whatever made them had been running on all fours. "Could be a bear," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Derek shook his head, kneeling beside the clearest print. "Wrong shape. And look here." He pointed to marks in the earth that looked almost like fingers. Bears don't have opposable thumbs. Tony made a joke about Bigfoot, but nobody laughed. We'd packed up camp quickly after that, deciding to push on toward the summit despite the late start. The fog had cleared enough to reveal the surrounding ridges, dark and imposing against the gray sky. Following our map, we located what should have been the trail to Hangover Lead, but it was little more than a game path winding steeply up through rhododendron thickets. The climb was brutal. The path, if it could be called that, switchbacked up the mountainside, often disappearing entirely beneath fallen logs or washouts from recent storms. We had to use our hands as much as our feet, pulling ourselves up rocky ledges and squeezing through gaps in the dense understory. It was Derek who noticed it first, the way the forest was changing around us as we climbed. The trees were different here, older and more twisted, their bark scarred with what looked like claw marks. Some of the scars were fresh, the wood pale and weeping sap. Others were old, grown over with moss and lichen, suggesting whatever had made them had been using this area for a long time. "What kind of animal could do this?" Tony asked, running his fingers along gouges that were easily 8 feet off the ground. Derek didn't answer, but I saw him check his knife, making sure it was secure on his belt. We reached what we thought was the summit around 4 p.m., only to discover it was a false peak. The real summit of Hangover Lead loomed another 500 feet above us, connected by a razor-thin ridge that our map hadn't indicated. More concerning was what we found at the false summit, the remains of a campsite. It was old, probably from early summer based on the vegetation growing through the scattered gear. A tent had been shredded, the fabric hanging in ribbons from bent aluminum poles. A backpack lay nearby, its contents strewn across the rocky ground, water bottles, energy bars, clothing, all torn and scattered as if something had been searching frantically through them. But it was the smell that made my stomach turn. Sweet and cloying, like meat left too long in the sun. It clung to everything, soaking into our nostrils until we could taste it on our tongues. "We need to report this," Marcus said, photographing the scene with his camera. "Someone's going to be looking for whoever was here." Derek was examining the tent fabric, his face grim. "These tears, they're not from weather. Something ripped this apart from the inside." The implications hung in the air between us like the lingering smell of decay. We should have turned back then, should have packed up and hiked out, reported what we'd found to the rangers, let the professionals deal with whatever had happened here. But we were tired, and the afternoon was getting late, and Derek pointed out that we'd already committed to camping one more night before our planned exit the next morning. "We'll camp down in the valley," he'd said, "away from this. Then we'll hike out first thing tomorrow." So we'd descended from the false summit, following the ridge down into a narrow valley that felt like the bottom of a well. Steep walls rose on all sides, covered in dense forest that seemed to swallow what little daylight remained. We found a flat spot near a small stream and set up camp as the shadows deepened around us. The sun disappeared behind the western ridge much earlier than we'd expected, plunging our campsite into premature twilight. Our fire seemed smaller here, its light barely reaching the tree line just 20 feet away. Beyond that circle of warmth and illumination lay a darkness so complete it felt solid, impenetrable. We tried to maintain normal conversation over dinner, but our voices kept trailing off as sounds emerged from the forest around us. Not the usual night sounds of owls and rustling leaves, but something else. Something that might have been movement in the underbrush, or might have been the wind. Something that might have been an animal call, or might have been something trying to imitate an animal call. "Probably just a fox," Derek said when we heard what sounded like a woman crying somewhere in the darkness. But he'd moved closer to the fire, and I noticed he'd placed his hunting knife within easy reach. Tony had gone quiet, his usual jokes replaced by nervous glances toward the tree line. Marcus kept checking his phone, though we all knew there was no signal this deep in the wilderness. It was around 10 p.m. when we heard the voice. At first, it sounded like someone calling for help from somewhere up the valley. A man's voice, hoarse and desperate, shouting something we couldn't quite make out. We all froze, listening, trying to pinpoint the direction. "Hello?" Marcus called back, his voice echoing off the ridges. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The voice came again, closer this time, but the words were wrong somehow. It was speaking English, but the rhythm was off, like someone reciting phonetic sounds without understanding their meaning. "Help. Me. Please. Help." Derek stood up, grabbing his flashlight. We should check it out. Someone might be hurt. But as he aimed his light toward the sound, the voice suddenly changed direction, coming from the opposite side of our campsite. Then it came from directly above us, as if someone were calling from the treetops. Then from underground. "Nobody's there," Tony whispered, his face pale in the firelight. "Whatever that is, it's not human." The voice stopped abruptly, leaving only the crackling of our fire and the sound of our own breathing. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, jumping at every small sound, until exhaustion finally drove us to our tents. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had died to glowing embers and the darkness beyond our campsite was absolute. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to Marcus's steady breathing in the tent beside me, when I heard the zipper. Slow, deliberate metal teeth separating one by one. It was coming from Derek's tent, just a few feet away. I could hear him moving around inside, probably getting up to use the bathroom or check on something. The zipper reached the bottom, and I heard footsteps on the forest floor. But the footsteps were wrong. Too heavy, and there were too many of them, as if Derek were walking on his hands and feet instead of just his feet. I waited for the sound of him returning, but it never came. The camp fell silent again, and eventually I drifted back to sleep, assuming he'd gone to relieve himself and I'd simply missed his return. I woke again just before dawn, my bladder demanding attention. The eastern ridge was beginning to glow with the first hint of sunrise, but our campsite was still shrouded in shadow. I unzipped my tent as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake the others. Derek's tent was empty. The sleeping bag was there, neatly arranged, but Derek was gone. His boots sat beside the tent entrance, laces still tied. His jacket hung from a tree branch where he'd left it the night before. Everything he'd need for a trip into the woods was still in camp. "Derek," I called softly, then louder. "Derek." Marcus emerged from his tent, hair disheveled. "What's wrong?" "Derek's gone. His stuff's all here, but he's not in his tent." Tony joined us, and we searched the immediate area, calling Derek's name and looking for any sign of where he might have gone. We found his tracks leading away from the tent toward the tree line, but they disappeared on the rocky ground beyond our campsite. "Maybe he went to get water," Tony suggested, but the stream was flowing right beside our camp. No reason to go anywhere else. We waited until full daylight, growing more concerned with each passing hour. Derek was the most experienced outdoorsman among us. He wouldn't just wander off in the dark without his gear, without telling anyone where he was going. By 9 a.m., we'd decided to start hiking out to get help. We left Derek's tent and gear in place, just as we'd found it, in case he returned. Marcus tied a note to a tree explaining where we'd gone and when we'd be back with help. But as we shouldered our packs and prepared to leave the valley, Derek appeared. He emerged from the tree line on the far side of our campsite, walking slowly and deliberately. At first, I felt a rush of relief. He was alive, he was okay. There was probably a simple explanation for where he'd been. But as he got closer, that relief turned to unease. Derek looked wrong. He was walking too straight, his shoulders too square, like a soldier on parade. His face was expressionless, his eyes fixed on some point beyond us. When he reached the campsite, he stopped just outside the ring of stones we'd used for our fire and stood perfectly still. "Derek?" Marcus stepped toward him. "Where the hell have you been? We've been worried sick." Derek turned his head to look at Marcus, but the movement was mechanical, like a security camera tracking motion. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "I went for a walk." "A walk? In the dark? Without your boots?" I looked down at Derek's feet. They were bare and filthy, covered in mud and what looked like dried blood, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "Derek, are you hurt?" I asked. "What happened to your feet?" He looked down at them as if seeing them for the first time, then back up at me. "I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Everything about him was wrong. The way he stood, the way he spoke, even the way he breathed seemed different. It was like looking at a photograph of Derek, a perfect reproduction that was missing some essential element that made him human. "We need to get you to a doctor," Tony said. "You might have hypothermia or—" "I'm fine," Derek repeated, and this time I caught it, the way his lips moved just slightly out of sync with his words, like a badly dubbed movie. Marcus was studying Derek with the same analytical expression he used when reviewing complex financial documents. "Derek, what's my middle name?" Derek stared at him for a long moment. "Middle name? That's not an answer. My middle name, what is it?" Silence. Derek's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He knew something was expected of him, but he didn't know what. "It's James," Tony whispered. "Derek's known that for 10 years. We all backed away from Derek then, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. This thing that looked like our friend, that wore his face and his clothes, didn't know Marcus's middle name, didn't remember the countless times Derek had teased Marcus about being named after a biblical king and an apostle. "Derek," I said carefully, "tell me about the time we went camping at Yellowstone." Another blank stare. "The trout you caught yesterday. What kind was it?" "Nothing." "What's my name?" Derek's head tilted slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound. When he spoke, his voice carried a subtle echo, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. "Kenneth." He knew my name, but the way he said it felt wrong. Too formal. Derek had called me Ken since freshman year of college. "We need to leave," Marcus said quietly. "Now." But as we turned toward the trail that would take us back down the valley, Derek moved. Not like a human moves, with unconscious gestures and natural flow, but like something that had studied human movement and was doing its best to imitate it. He stepped directly in front of us, blocking our path. "Where are you going?" he asked. "We're hiking out," Marcus said. "All of us. Come on, Derek, let's get you some help." "I don't need help. I'm fine." The thing that looked like Derek smiled then, and I nearly vomited. It was Derek's smile, but stretched too wide, held too long. His teeth seemed different too, sharper somehow, though I couldn't say exactly how. "We're staying here," Derek said. "We're staying together." Tony tried to step around him, but Derek moved again, faster than any human should be able to move. One moment he was standing in front of us, the next he was beside Tony, his hand on Tony's shoulder. "We're staying," he repeated, and his grip tightened until Tony winced in pain. "Let go of me," Tony said, but his voice was shaking. Derek's smile grew wider. "We're all staying together, forever." That's when Marcus pulled out his bear spray. "Let him go, Derek. Or whatever you are." Derek turned that mechanical head toward Marcus, and for just a moment, I saw something else looking out through his eyes. Something hungry and ancient, and utterly inhuman. "You can't leave," it said, and now Derek's voice carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. "You know too much. You've seen too much." Marcus triggered the bear spray, sending a stream of concentrated pepper spray directly into Derek's face. A normal person would have been incapacitated instantly, writhing on the ground, temporarily blinded and struggling to breathe. Derek didn't even blink. The spray hit him full in the face and he just stood there, still smiling, still gripping Tony's shoulder. If anything, the smile got wider. "That's not very friendly," Derek said, and then he twisted Tony's arm. The sound of breaking bone was sharp and wet, like stepping on a branch full of sap. Tony screamed and dropped to his knees, his arm hanging at an impossible angle. "Run!" Marcus shouted, but Derek was already moving again. He leaped. No, that's not right. He flowed through the air like liquid shadow, crossing the 20 feet between him and Marcus in a heartbeat. His hands, which had looked like Derek's hands just moments before, now ended in claws that gleamed like black glass. Those claws went through Marcus's chest like it was made of paper. Marcus looked down at the 4 parallel tears in his jacket, at the spreading red stain, and his face went through a whole range of emotions in the space of a second. Surprise, confusion, fear, and finally a kind of sad understanding. "Kenneth," he said, blood bubbling from his lips, "run." Then Derek, the thing wearing Derek's face, lifted Marcus off the ground with one hand and threw him against a tree. The impact made a sound like a wet towel hitting concrete. Marcus didn't get back up. I ran. I left Tony there screaming and clutching his broken arm. I left Marcus's body crumpled against that tree. I ran through the forest like a madman, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, not caring about the branches that tore at my clothes and skin. Behind me, I could hear Derek calling my name. But it wasn't Derek's voice anymore. It was something else, something that had learned to make human sounds but hadn't quite mastered the nuances. My name echoed through the valley, bouncing off the ridges, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Kenneth. Kenneth. Where are you going? Kenneth? I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing beside a small creek somewhere deep in the forest. I had no idea where I was, no idea which direction led back to civilization. All I knew was that I had to get away from that thing, had to warn someone about what was happening in these mountains. But even as I lay there gasping, trying to figure out my next move, I heard them. Footsteps, coming through the forest with the steady mechanical rhythm I'd learned to fear. Kenneth. The voice was closer now, maybe 100 yards away. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I forced myself to move, following the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me to a larger stream, then a river, then maybe a road. My map and compass were back at the campsite with the rest of my gear, but I knew that water generally flows toward civilization. The creek led me through a narrow gorge where the walls rose steep and high on both sides. It was darker here, the tree canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. Perfect hiding spots lurked behind every boulder and fallen tree, but they also provided perfect ambush points for whatever was hunting me. I could still hear Derek's voice echoing through the forest, sometimes close, sometimes distant, as if he were moving in random patterns through the wilderness. But there was a method to it, I realized. He was herding me, driving me in a specific direction like a wolf drives deer. The creek eventually joined a larger stream, and I followed that downstream, moving as quietly as possible over the moss-covered rocks. My feet were soaked and cold, but I didn't dare stop to change into dry socks. Every few minutes I would pause and listen, trying to determine if I was still being followed. It was during one of these pauses that I heard Tony screaming. It came from somewhere behind me, maybe a mile away, carrying clear and sharp through the mountain air. Not the scream of pain from his broken arm, but something worse. Something that spoke of terror so profound it stripped away everything human and reduced him to a raw, animal sound. The screaming went on for a long time, too long. Then it stopped abruptly, cut off mid-breath. I kept moving downstream, forcing myself not to think about what had happened to Tony, focusing only on putting distance between myself and whatever was wearing Derek's face. The stream eventually led me to what looked like an old logging road, overgrown but still passable. Following the road seemed like my best bet for finding my way out of the wilderness, so I started walking, keeping to the shadows at the road's edge in case I needed to hide quickly. My legs felt like rubber, and my stomach was cramping from dehydration and fear, but I kept moving. The road wound through the forest for what felt like hours before finally emerging onto a paved highway. I nearly cried with relief when I saw the yellow lines and the mile markers. Civilization, safety, people who would believe what I'd experienced and could help me get the authorities involved. I flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a pickup truck driven by an elderly man in a John Deere cap. He took one look at my torn clothes and wild expression and immediately offered to drive me to the nearest town. "You okay, son?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to tell him what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. How do you explain to someone that your friend was replaced by something inhuman? How do you describe watching that thing murder your other friends? "Hiking accident," I managed to say. "My friends, they're still out there. We need to call for help." The man, he said his name was Earl, drove me straight to the sheriff's office in a small town called Burnsville. I told the deputies everything, showed them on their maps where we'd been camping, described the destroyed campsite we'd found on the falls summit. They listened with the professional patience of people who'd heard every kind of wilderness emergency story imaginable. Missing hikers, bear attacks, exposure, falls from cliffs. They'd seen it all. But I could tell they thought I was suffering from hypothermia or shock, that my account of Derek's transformation was the product of trauma and exhaustion. Still, they organized a search and rescue operation. By that evening, a team of rangers and volunteers was heading into the Joyce-Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness to look for Marcus and Tony. They found our campsite the next morning, along with Derek's abandoned tent and gear. They found Marcus's body where I'd said it would be, though the official report listed the cause of death as a fall from a steep ridge. They never found Tony or Derek. The rangers also found the destroyed campsite on the falls summit, but when they investigated, they discovered it wasn't from early summer as I'd thought. According to the gear they recovered, that campsite had been destroyed 3 days ago, while we were hiking into the area. Someone else had been up there. Someone else had encountered whatever was living in those mountains. The official investigation concluded that Derek had suffered some kind of psychotic break, killing Marcus and Tony before disappearing into the wilderness. The injuries I described were attributed to my own fall during my panicked flight from the scene. Post-traumatic stress, they said. Survivor's guilt. My mind trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. But I know what I saw. I know what Derek became, or what replaced him. And I know it's still out there. That was 6 months ago. I've tried to move on, tried to convince myself that maybe the doctors and investigators were right. Maybe the stress and exhaustion and grief did cause me to imagine things that weren't real. But then I started researching the history of that area, looking into missing persons reports and unexplained deaths in the Joyce-Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness. What I found keeps me awake at night. People have been disappearing in those mountains for decades. Hikers, hunters, researchers, they go in and never come out. Or sometimes they do come out, but they're different, changed. Their families and friends notice it immediately, but they can never quite explain what's wrong. There are stories from the Cherokee who lived in those mountains before European settlement. Stories about the Keklikudle, creatures that could take the shape of humans but were always hungry for more than food. They hungered for humanity itself, consuming not just flesh but identity, memory, the essence of what made a person who they were. The Cherokee avoided certain valleys and ridges, places where the Keklikudle were said to hunt. According to the old stories, these creatures were once human themselves, people who had been consumed by an insatiable hunger that eventually transformed them into something else. Something that could wear human faces like masks, but could never quite get the performance right. One story stood out from the rest. It described a valley where the sun disappeared too early and the darkness felt solid and hungry, a place where voices called from the forest, mimicking human speech but always slightly wrong, a place where people went missing and came back as hollow echoes of themselves. The description matched our campsite perfectly. I've tried to warn people. I've posted on hiking forums and contacted the Forest Service, but nobody takes me seriously. They think I'm just another traumatized survivor trying to make sense of a tragedy. But sometimes, late at night, I get phone calls. The voice sounds like Derek, but not quite right. It knows things about me that only Derek would know, but it says them in that flat, mechanical way I remember from that morning in the valley. "Kenneth," it says, "why did you leave us? We're still here. We're waiting for you to come back. I've changed my phone number 3 times, but it always finds me. Last week, I saw Derek at a coffee shop in downtown Charlotte. He was sitting at a corner table, wearing the same clothes he'd been wearing that last day in the mountains. He looked exactly the same. No older, no signs of having spent 6 months living rough in the wilderness. When he saw me, he smiled that too wide smile and waved. I ran. I've been thinking about moving, maybe to another state entirely, somewhere far from the mountains, far from whatever is wearing my friend's face. But I don't think distance will matter. I think it's connected to me now, drawn by some invisible thread that stretches across any amount of space. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Slow, deliberate, mechanical footsteps that stop just outside my threshold. They never try the door, never knock. They just stand there, waiting. I think they're waiting for me to give up, to stop running, to accept that I can't escape what happened in those mountains. But I won't give up. I can't, because I know that if I do, if I let whatever took Derek finally claim me, then Marcus and Tony will have died for nothing. So I'm writing this down, all of it, everything I remember. If something happens to me, if I disappear, or if people start noticing that I'm acting strange, then maybe someone will read this and understand what's really happening. The Kekle Kudla are real. They hunt in the remote places where people don't expect to find anything more dangerous than bears or falling rocks. They take people and wear their identities like ill-fitting clothes, trying to pass among us but never quite managing to fool those who look closely enough. And they're spreading, moving beyond their traditional hunting grounds, following hiking trails and mountain roads into populated areas, learning to blend in better with each victim they claim. I don't know how to stop them. I don't know if they can be stopped. All I know is that if you ever go hiking in the remote wilderness, and you encounter someone who seems just slightly wrong, someone whose smile is too wide or whose voice is too flat, or who doesn't remember things they should remember, then run. Run as fast and as far as you can. And whatever you do, don't let them follow you home. The footsteps in the hallway have started again. They're closer to my door tonight than they've ever been before. I think my time is running out. My name is Michael Williams and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina, near the abandoned logging settlement of Mortimer, where the Appalachian Mountains swallow hikers whole and spit out only bones. David Jones had been my best friend since college, the kind of guy who could make you laugh even when your world was falling apart. We'd planned this 3-day backpacking trip for months, needing to escape the suffocating routine of our corporate jobs in Charlotte. The plan was simple: hike the old Mortimer Trail, camp in the designated wilderness area near Curtis Creek, and disconnect from civilization for 72 hours. What we found instead was something that had been waiting in those mountains far longer than civilization itself. The first sign something was wrong came at the trailhead. The wooden sign marking the Mortimer Trail looked different from the photos we'd studied online. The paint was more faded, the wood more weathered, and someone had carved symbols into it that looked disturbingly like scratch marks. Deep gouges that went clean through the wood in parallel lines, as if massive claws had raked across the surface. "Probably just bears marking their territory," David said, adjusting his pack straps. His sandy hair caught the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the canopy. Or maybe some drunk teenagers with knives. I nodded, but something about those marks made my skin crawl. They were too precise, too deliberate, and there was a smell lingering around the sign, sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. The trail started easy enough. We followed a well-worn path through dense rhododendron thickets and towering hemlocks, the familiar rhythm of hiking boots on packed earth calming my nerves. David kept up his usual chatter about work gossip and weekend plans, his voice echoing off the rocky outcroppings that jutted from the mountainside like broken teeth. but as we climbed higher into the remote wilderness, the trail began to deteriorate. What had started as a clear path became increasingly overgrown, forcing us to push through brambles that seemed to grab at our clothing with unusual persistence. Thorns that should have bent away from pressure instead dug deeper, leaving long scratches on our arms that wept tiny beads of blood. "GPS is acting weird," David said, stopping to check his phone. The screen cast a sickly blue glow in the gathering dusk. "It keeps showing us in 3 different locations." I pulled out my own phone, but the screen was completely black. "Mine's dead," I said, pressing the power button repeatedly. "That's impossible. I charged it full before we left." David frowned at his device. "Battery shows full, but the map keeps glitching. Look at this." He held the screen toward me. The topographical map flickered between different versions of the same area, sometimes showing a trail where we stood, sometimes showing only wilderness, sometimes displaying what looked like buildings that definitely weren't on any modern map. "Probably just poor cell coverage up here," I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. We brought the paper maps as backup. We made camp in a small clearing that felt wrong from the moment we set foot in it. The grass was too green, too perfect, forming an almost perfect circle surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward like spectators gathering around a stage. In the center of the clearing stood a single white oak, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, with bark that looked diseased, mottled with dark patches that resembled burn scars. "This is perfect," David said, dropping his pack near the base of the oak. "Natural windbreak, level ground, close to that stream we passed." But I noticed things David seemed to miss. The absolute silence, for one. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The air itself felt thick and stagnant, like breathing through wet cotton. And there was that smell again, sweet decay that made my stomach turn. We set up our tents with mechanical efficiency born from years of camping together. David's cheerful demeanor never wavered, but I caught him glancing at the tree line with increasing frequency as darkness fell. When he thought I wasn't looking, his smile would slip, revealing something anxious underneath. The fire refused to catch properly. We'd brought seasoned firewood and quality kindling, but the flames kept sputtering and dying as if something was actively smothering them. When we finally got a small blaze going, the smoke rose straight up in an unnatural column, never wavering despite the breeze that rustled the leaves around us. "Remember that camping trip in the Smokies when we were 22? David asked, staring into the struggling flames. "When you got food poisoning from that gas station sandwich and I had to hike out for help?" I nodded, but something felt off about the memory. Had it been food poisoning? I seemed to remember something else. Something about David leaving me alone in the tent for hours, coming back different somehow. But the details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. "You never did tell me where you went that night," I said. David looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a blank, almost predatory stare that lasted just a moment too long. "What do you mean?" "When you went for help, you were gone from midnight until dawn. The ranger station was only 2 miles away." "I don't remember it taking that long," he said, but his voice had changed. Flatter, more mechanical. "Maybe you were just delirious from the fever." The fire died again, plunging us into darkness so complete it felt solid. I fumbled for my flashlight, but the beam seemed weaker than it should be, as if the darkness was actively absorbing the light. In the pale circle of illumination, David's face looked different, gaunt, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. "We should get some sleep," he said. "Long hike tomorrow." I wanted to argue, wanted to suggest we pack up and hike out by flashlight, but exhaustion hit me like a physical weight. My eyelids felt heavy, and the thought of crawling into my sleeping bag became overwhelmingly appealing despite every instinct screaming that we needed to leave this place. I woke to the sound of my tent zipper opening from the outside. The fabric peeled back slowly, deliberately, and I could see a dark silhouette crouched at the entrance. My first groggy thought was that David needed something, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized the figure was too tall, too angular, and it was breathing wrong. Long, rattling inhalations followed by complete silence. "David?" I whispered. The figure's head turned toward me with a motion too fluid for human neck joints. In the faint starlight filtering through the trees, I caught a glimpse of features that were familiar yet fundamentally wrong. David's face, but stretched, elongated, with eyes that had sunk deep into the skull and reflected light like mirror fragments. "Mike," it said in David's voice, but the sound came from somewhere deep in its chest. "Come outside. I want to show you something." Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to stay put, but my body began moving of its own accord. I found myself unzipping my sleeping bag, pulling on my boots, crawling toward the tent entrance where the thing that looked like David waited with infinite patience. The night air hit my skin like ice water, and suddenly I could think clearly again. The thing had moved away from my tent and stood near the base of the diseased oak, its form shifting slightly in the darkness as if its edges couldn't hold a consistent shape. "Where's David?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I'm right here," it said, and the voice was perfect now, absolutely identical to my friend's. "Don't you recognize me?" But I'd known David for 12 years, and this thing moved wrong. David had a slight limp from an old soccer injury, favoring his left leg. This creature moved with predatory grace, weight distributed perfectly, muscles coiled like springs. "Where did you go when you left me in the Smokies?" I asked. The thing's head tilted at an impossible angle. "I told you. I went for help." "No," I said, memories flooding back with sudden, terrible clarity. "You disappeared for 3 hours that first night, before I got sick. When you came back, you were different, hungrier. And the next morning, that family camping near us was gone. Just their empty tent with the sleeping bags unzipped from the inside." The creature that wore David's face smiled, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp, filed to points like broken glass. "You always were too smart for your own good, Mike." It began to change then, David's familiar features stretching and distorting like hot wax, the jaw unhinged with a wet, tearing sound, revealing a throat lined with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Arms elongated, fingers extending into razor-tipped claws. The friendly face I'd known for over a decade melted away, revealing something ancient and starving underneath. But the worst part was the eyes. David's eyes, unchanged, staring out from this nightmare with the expression of absolute terror. My friend was still in there somewhere, trapped and screaming, and, "David," I whispered, "fight it." The creature laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "There is no David anymore. There's only hunger, always hunger." It lunged with inhuman speed, crossing the 20 feet between us in a single bound. Claws raked across my chest, shredding my shirt and leaving 4 parallel gashes that burned like acid. I threw myself sideways, rolling behind my tent, feeling the creature's breath on my neck as it missed my throat by inches. "You can't run, Mike," it called, circling the campsite with deliberate slowness. "Not in my woods. These mountains know me. They've fed me for centuries." I grabbed my pack and pulled out the camping hatchet, its weight reassuring in my trembling hands. The creature laughed again. "What are you going to do with that little toy? I've been perfecting this dance since before your great-grandfather was born. Every few years, someone new comes into my territory. Sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. They always think they can fight." It was toying with me, I realized. This thing could have killed me already if it wanted. It was savoring the fear, feeding off the terror like a fine wine. "What are you?" I asked, backing toward the tree line. "You white folks have so many names for us," it said, David's voice emerging from that twisted throat. "Wendigo, Skinwalker, the hunger that walks. But we were here first, Mike. Before your roads and your cities and your lights, we owned these mountains when they were still seabeds." The creature moved closer, and I could smell the decay rolling off it in waves. Sweet rot and old blood and something else, something that made my stomach clench with revulsion. The best part, it continued conversationally, is that I get to keep their memories. Every person I've taken, every life I've consumed, they're all still here. It tapped the side of its elongated skull with one claw. David's in here, watching everything, feeling everything. He knows what I'm going to do to you, and he can't stop it any more than he could stop me from taking those other campers 2 years ago. Rage flared hot in my chest, overriding the terror. Let him go. "Oh, Mike," the creature said, and for a moment David's anguished expression flickered across its features. "You still don't understand. I don't take people. I become them. David invited me in the moment he chose to eat meat that wasn't meant for human consumption." The memory hit me like a physical blow. That night in the Smokies, David had found something in the woods, claimed it was deer meat, but it had looked wrong. Too red, too fresh. I'd refused to eat it, getting sick from the gas station sandwich instead. But David had consumed every piece, smiling with bloody teeth. "The hunger changes you from the inside out," the creature explained. "First, just meat, then fresher meat, then..." It gestured to itself with evident pride. "Transformation." I raised the hatchet, but my hands were shaking too badly to be accurate. The creature noticed and grinned wider. "David fought for months," it said, "the hunger growing stronger every day. Do you know what finally broke him? It was watching you sleep, imagining how sweet your blood would taste, how tender your flesh would be. He tried to resist, but the hunger always wins in the end." The creature crouched low, preparing to spring. I could see muscles bunching under David's clothes, which had somehow remained intact despite the radical changes to his body. As if the thing was maintaining the illusion for my benefit. "Any last words?" it asked. "Yeah," I said, and swung the hatchet with every ounce of strength I possessed. The blade caught the creature in the shoulder, biting deep into the joint where David's familiar clavicle used to be. It screamed, a sound like tearing metal that echoed off the mountains and seemed to go on forever. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, sizzling where it hit the ground. But instead of falling, the creature's scream turned into laughter. "Is that the best you can do?" The wound was already healing, flesh knitting back together with disturbing wet sounds. But I'd seen something in its eyes during that moment of pain, fear. This thing could be hurt. I yanked the hatchet free and swung again, this time aiming for the neck. The creature caught my wrist in a grip that felt like a bear trap, bones grinding together as it squeezed. The hatchet fell from my nerveless fingers. "My turn," it said. Claws raked across my thigh, opening gashes so deep I could see bone gleaming white in the darkness. I screamed and fell, hot blood soaking through my pants. The creature loomed over me, savoring my pain. "I'm going to take my time with you," it said. "David's memories tell me all your favorite things. I'll make sure to destroy each one slowly." It grabbed my ankle and began dragging me toward the diseased oak. As we got closer, I could see that the dark patches on the bark weren't scars at all. They were symbols, carved deep into the living wood, ancient pictographs that seemed to writhe in the corner of my vision. "This is where it happens," the creature explained, "where the transformation completes. The tree drinks the blood, and the hunger grows stronger." I clawed at the ground, fingernails breaking as I tried to find purchase. My hand closed around a rock and I hurled it at the creature's head without much hope of doing damage. But the stone struck perfectly, hitting the healing wound on its shoulder. The creature dropped my ankle with another inhuman shriek, staggering backward. And in that moment, I saw something impossible. David's face emerged from the distorted features just for an instant. His mouth moved, forming a single word. Fire. Understanding flooded through me. I rolled toward our dying campfire, grabbing a half-burned branch that still glowed at one end. The creature recovered quickly, lunging after me, but I thrust the burning wood directly into its face. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The thing's flesh began to smoke and bubble, filling the air with the stench of burning hair and meat. It fell backward, clawing at its face, screaming in a voice that was purely David's now, confused and terrified. "Mike!" David's voice, small and lost. "Mike, what's happening to me?" I grabbed the gasoline we'd brought for our camp stove and doused the creature as it writhed on the ground. When I touched the burning branch to the fuel, flames erupted across its body with a whooshing sound. But even as it burned, the thing kept changing. Sometimes it was David, screaming for help. Sometimes it was the ancient horror, promising revenge. Sometimes it was faces I didn't recognize. Other hikers, other victims, all trapped inside this consuming nightmare. "I'm sorry," I whispered as David's eyes met mine through the flames. "I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," he managed to say, his voice growing weaker. "I chose this. I was so hungry, Mike. So hungry, and that meat tasted so good." The fire burned for hours, far longer than should have been possible. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but a pile of ash that the morning wind scattered across the clearing. I limped out of those mountains with a shattered leg and deep claw marks that would never fully heal. The official report listed David as missing, presumed dead in a hiking accident. Search teams found no trace of him, which wasn't surprising considering he'd been reduced to ash and blown away. But sometimes, late at night, I still get text messages from David's phone, pictures of hikers on remote trails, GPS coordinates for isolated campsites, and always the same message. "Come join me. I'm so hungry. I don't go camping anymore. Haven't touched meat in 2 years." Because I remember how David looked at that deer flesh in the Smokies, the hunger in his eyes as he tore into it with his teeth. And I remember how good it smelled when it was cooking. Sometimes I catch myself staring at raw hamburger in the grocery store, saliva pooling in my mouth. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, dreaming of warm blood and tender flesh. The doctors say it's PTSD, trauma manifesting as intrusive thoughts. But I know better. The hunger is patient. The hunger is eternal. And once it gets its claws into you, it never really lets go. The Wendigo that killed my best friend is gone, burned to ash and scattered to the wind. But there are others out there, waiting in the deep woods where cell phones don't work and GPS loses signal. Ancient things that remember when these mountains were young, still hungry after all these centuries. And sometimes, when the moon is dark and the wind is still, I can feel something watching me from the tree line behind my house. Something that knows I've tasted the hunger even if I never fed it. Something that's waiting for me to get hungry enough to accept its invitation. The mountains remember. The hunger endures. And David's phone keeps sending messages I'm too terrified to block, because part of me, the part that smells cooking meat and feels my mouth water, wants to know where those coordinates lead. I'm 34 years old, and I've seen what lives in the deep places where humans aren't meant to go. I've watched my best friend become something monstrous, and I've felt the first whispers of that same hunger in my own soul. The worst part isn't what happened in those mountains. The worst part is knowing it's not over. It's never really over, because the hunger is patient and it knows where I live. Where? My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina, where the ancient peaks pierce the sky like broken teeth and the forests hold secrets older than memory. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. 5 friends from the accounting firm where we all worked, escaping the fluorescent-lit cubicles for 3 days of hiking and camping. Michael Williams, our self-appointed group leader with his perfectly organized gear and color-coded maps, had planned everything down to the minute. Jennifer Davis, my college roommate and closest friend, bounced with excitement as we loaded our packs. Brian Wright cracked jokes to mask his obvious nervousness about sleeping outdoors, while Amanda Parker snapped endless photos of everything, determined to document our epic adventure for social media. I should have paid more attention to the warnings. The park ranger at the visitor center, a weathered man named Earl with eyes like winter shadows, had looked at our planned route and frowned. "Y'all sure about heading into the Boone Fork area this time of year?" he'd asked, his gnarled finger tracing our path on the topographical map. Been some unusual reports coming out of there lately. Michael, ever the pragmatist, had dismissed the ranger's concerns with a confident laugh. "What kind of reports?" Earl's jaw worked silently for a moment, as if chewing on words he didn't want to speak. Hikers going missing for days, then turning up acting strange. Wild animal attacks that don't match any known predator patterns. Equipment failures that can't be explained. He paused, studying our eager faces. And sounds at night that, well, sounds that don't belong to anything natural. But we were young professionals from Charlotte, armed with GPS devices, satellite phones, and the unshakable confidence that comes from never having encountered anything truly threatening. We thanked Earl politely, collected our permits, and drove to the trailhead with our windows down, singing along to the radio. The first day of hiking was perfect. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and the mountains blazed with autumn colors so vibrant they seemed almost artificial. We made good time on the well-marked trail, pausing frequently for Jennifer to photograph the spectacular views and for Brian to catch his breath. His office job hadn't prepared him for the steep grades. By late afternoon, we reached our planned campsite near a crystal-clear stream that burbled over smooth stones. The clearing was surrounded by towering hemlocks and rhododendron thickets, creating a natural cathedral that felt both majestic and strangely intimate. Michael immediately began setting up his elaborate camp system while the rest of us explored the area. "This place is incredible," Amanda said, spinning in a slow circle with her camera raised. "It's like something out of a fairy tale." I nodded, but something about her words sent an odd chill down my spine. Fairy tales, I remembered, were originally warnings about the dangers that lurked in dark forests. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, we gathered around our campfire. Brian had surprised us all by proving surprisingly adept at building fires, and soon we were roasting hot dogs and sharing ghost stories. The flames danced hypnotically, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. "I've got one," Jennifer said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "Have you guys ever heard of skinwalkers?" Michael rolled his eyes. "Those aren't even from this region. That's Navajo folklore from the Southwest." "Actually," Amanda said, consulting her phone, "there are similar legends throughout North America. Different names, but the same basic concept. Humans who can take the shape of animals, usually for evil purposes." "Great bedtime story material," Brian muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "Thanks for that." But Jennifer continued, apparently oblivious to his sarcasm. "The thing about skinwalkers is that they're not born monsters. They choose to become them. They have to kill someone close to them, usually a family member, to gain the power. And once they transform, they can never fully return to their human form. Something always remains wrong." The fire crackled loudly, sending a shower of sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. In the sudden quiet that followed, I could have sworn I heard something moving in the forest beyond our circle of light, a rustling that was too deliberate to be wind, too large to be a small animal. "Did you hear that?" I asked. We all froze, straining our ears. For a long moment there was nothing but the normal sounds of evening. The stream's gentle murmur, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then, just as we were beginning to relax, it came again. A sound like something large moving through the underbrush, circling our camp at the very edge of audibility. "Probably just a deer," Michael said. But his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Or a bear," Brian added, his grip tightening on his makeshift poker. We decided to turn in early, though none of us admitted that the sounds had unnerved us. As I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I noticed that my satellite phone, which had shown full signal strength earlier, now displayed no service despite our location being well within the coverage area Michael had researched. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of deep night, but rather the oppressive absence of sound that comes when every living thing is holding its breath. No insects chirped, no owls called. Even the stream seemed to have muted its constant babble to barely a whisper. I lay perfectly still in my tent, every nerve ending alert. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see the dying embers of our fire casting a faint red glow. The moon, which had been nearly full when we'd gone to sleep, was now completely obscured by clouds that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Then I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and distinctly human in their rhythm. But there was something wrong with the gait. Too long between steps, as if whoever was walking was taking unnaturally large strides. The footsteps circled our camp methodically, pausing at each tent as if taking inventory of the occupants. My heart hammered against my ribs as the footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, rasping inhalations that went on far too long to be natural. Through the fabric, I could make out a silhouette that was roughly human-shaped but somehow distorted, as if the proportions were slightly off. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but some primal instinct kept me frozen and silent. The shadow remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, without warning, it moved away, the unnatural footsteps resuming their circuit of our camp. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning brought relief in the form of bright sunshine and the return of normal forest sounds. When I emerged from my tent, bleary-eyed and on edge, I found the others already awake and gathered around the rebuilt fire. "Anyone else have trouble sleeping?" Jennifer asked, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Something was definitely out there," Brian said. "I heard it too." Michael, ever the skeptic, was examining the ground around our campsite. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of impressions in the soft earth near the stream. "These look like footprints, but—" We crowded around to look. The prints were roughly human in shape but elongated, as if made by someone with unnaturally long feet. Stranger still, they seemed to begin and end randomly, appearing out of nowhere in the middle of our camp and disappearing just as abruptly into the forest. "Could be some kind of hoax," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Out here?" Amanda gestured at the vast wilderness surrounding us. Who would even know we were here? We packed up quickly after that, eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had visited us in the night. The plan had been to hike deeper into the wilderness, but the morning's discovery had shaken our confidence. We decided to head for a different area, one closer to the main trails where we might encounter other hikers. But as we consulted our maps and GPS devices, we discovered our first real problem. None of our electronic equipment was working properly. The GPS units showed conflicting locations, placing us anywhere from our actual coordinates to somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Our phones had no signal, despite being in an area where coverage should have been available. Even Michael's analog compass seemed to be spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "Solar flare activity?" Amanda suggested weakly, but we all knew that wouldn't explain the compass malfunction. We decided to rely on the paper topographical map and our basic navigation skills, following the stream downstream until we intersected with a marked trail. It should have been a simple 3-hour hike to our backup campsite, but 3 hours passed, then 4, then 5, and still we found no trail. The landscape around us seemed to shift subtly when we weren't looking directly at it. Trees that I could have sworn were positioned one way appeared to have moved when I glanced back over my shoulder. The stream, which had been flowing consistently eastward according to our map, began meandering in directions that defied topography. "We're lost," Brian said, what we were all thinking. His face was flushed from exertion and stress, sweat staining his shirt despite the cool mountain air. "We're not lost," Michael insisted. though his usual commanding tone had developed a slight tremor. "We just need to get our bearings. Let's climb that ridge and see if we can spot any landmarks." The ridge turned out to be farther away and steeper than it had appeared. By the time we reached the top, the sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks, and our water supplies were running dangerously low. From our vantage point, we could see nothing but endless forest stretching in all directions. No roads, no buildings, no sign of human presence anywhere. "That's impossible," Jennifer whispered. "We can't be more than a few miles from the main trail." But as we studied the landscape below us, a horrible realization began to dawn. The forest spread out beneath us looked primordial, untouched by human hands. There were no power lines cutting through the trees, no distant highways, no airplane contrails in the sky. It was as if we had somehow stepped outside the modern world entirely. "We need to find shelter for the night," Michael said, his voice carefully controlled. "And we need to find water." We descended the far side of the ridge as the shadows began to lengthen. The forest here felt different, older somehow, and filled with an oppressive sense of being watched. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the remaining daylight. Strange sounds echoed from the depths of the woods, creaking and groaning that didn't match the rhythm of wind through branches, distant calls that might have been birds but sounded disturbingly like human voices. Just as true darkness began to fall, we stumbled into a small clearing beside a stagnant pool. The water was brackish and uninviting, but it was wet, and we were beyond being picky. Michael broke out his water purification tablets while the rest of us gathered wood for a fire. That's when Amanda screamed. We spun around to find her pointing at something at the edge of the clearing. There, hanging from a low branch like some macabre ornament, was what appeared to be a backpack. But as we moved closer with our flashlights, we could see that it wasn't quite right. The fabric was the correct color and pattern, but it seemed to be made of something organic, something that glistened wetly in our lights and gave off a nauseating, coppery smell. "That's not a backpack," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. She was right. It was skin. Human skin, flayed and shaped to resemble a hiking pack, complete with what looked like zippers made from strips of sinew. But the most horrifying detail was the face, or what had been a face, stretched across the main compartment, features distorted but still recognizable as human. Brian vomited into the bushes. "We need to leave," Amanda said, backing away from the grotesque display. "We need to leave right now." But before we could move, the thing hanging from the tree began to twitch. The dead eyes rolled in their sockets, focusing on us with an intelligence that shouldn't have been possible. The mouth, stretched impossibly wide, began to work soundlessly, as if trying to speak. Then it began to whisper. The words were in no language I recognized, but somehow I understood their meaning. They spoke of hunger and transformation, of the ecstasy of shedding human limitations and embracing something far more primal. They promised us release from our small, fearful lives if we would only stop running and accept what was coming. "Don't listen," Michael shouted, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. The whispers were growing louder, more insistent, and I found myself taking a step toward the hanging horror despite every rational thought screaming at me to run. Jennifer grabbed my arm, breaking the spell. "Sarah, we have to go." We ran blindly into the forest, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots in our panic. Behind us, the whispers rose to a shriek that echoed through the trees like the cry of some enormous predatory bird. Something large was following us. I could hear it moving through the forest with the fluid grace of a natural predator, gaining ground despite our headlong flight. We burst out of the trees onto what appeared to be a trail, though it was narrower and more overgrown than any marked path should have been. Without discussion, we turned and ran along it, our flashlights creating wild, bouncing circles of illumination in the darkness ahead. The trail led downward through a series of switchbacks, eventually emerging into a valley that I didn't remember from any of our maps. At the bottom, barely visible through the trees, we could make out the flickering glow of what appeared to be a campfire. "Thank God," Brian gasped. "Other people." But as we approached the light, a new dread began to settle in my stomach. The fire was too large, burning too brightly, and it cast shadows that moved independently of the flames. Worse, there was something wrong with the silence surrounding it. The same oppressive quiet we had experienced the night before. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, hidden behind a screen of rhododendron bushes. The fire burned in the center of a rough circle of stones, but there was no camping equipment visible, no tents, no sleeping bags, no sign of the modern hikers we had hoped to find. Instead, arranged around the fire in a grotesque parody of a social gathering, were figures that had once been human. They sat perfectly motionless, their backs to us, staring into the flames with an intensity that was immediately unsettling. Their clothes were the remnants of hiking gear, torn and stained fabric that hung in tatters from emaciated frames. But it was their posture that made my skin crawl. Too rigid, too perfect, as if they were marionettes held upright by invisible strings. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, but even as I spoke, one of the figures began to turn its head. The movement was wrong in every possible way. The head rotated a full 180 degrees without the body moving at all, neck twisting like an owl's but with the slow, deliberate motion of something that had all the time in the world. When the face came into view, I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. It had been human once, but something had reshaped it into a carnival mirror reflection of humanity. The features were stretched and distorted, eyes too large and placed too far apart, mouth extending from ear to ear in a permanent grin that revealed too many teeth. The skin had a waxy, translucent quality that allowed us to see the dark network of veins beneath. "Welcome," it said, and its voice was the sound of wind through dried leaves. "We've been waiting for you." The other figures began to turn as well, each movement accompanied by the wet sound of joints separating and reforming. Soon, we were facing a semicircle of horrors, all wearing that same impossible smile, all speaking in perfect unison. "The hunt is over. The feast can begin." We turned and ran. This time our flight was pure terror-driven instinct. We crashed through the forest like wild animals, no longer caring about direction or destination, concerned only with putting distance between ourselves and the things around the fire. Branches tore at our clothes and faces, roots caught our feet, but we kept running. It was Jennifer who fell first. I heard her cry out behind me and turned to see her sprawled on the ground, clutching her ankle. In the wildly swinging beam of my flashlight, I could see the unnatural angle of her foot. "I think it's broken," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. Michael and Brian doubled back to help while Amanda and I formed a defensive perimeter, though what we thought we could defend against with nothing but hiking poles and camping knives. I didn't know. The forest around us had gone silent again, but this time the quiet felt expectant, like the pause before a predator strikes. "Can you walk?" Michael asked, helping Jennifer to her feet. She tried to put weight on the injured ankle and immediately collapsed with a strangled scream. I can't do it." "We'll carry her," Brian said, but we all knew it was hopeless. We were exhausted, lost, and being hunted by something that defied rational explanation. Carrying Jennifer would slow us down to the point where whatever was following us would inevitably catch up. "Leave me," Jennifer whispered. Just leave me and get help." "Absolutely not," I said, but even as I spoke I could hear sounds in the forest around us, the snap of breaking branches, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. They were getting closer. "There," Amanda said suddenly, pointing into the darkness. "I see a light." Through the trees, perhaps 100 yards away, a warm yellow glow flickered invitingly. It looked like a cabin window. Real electric light, not the supernatural fire we had encountered earlier. "It could be a trap," Michael said. "Everything's a trap," Brian replied, "but it's the only option we have." Supporting Jennifer between us, we made our way toward the light. It was indeed a cabin, a rustic structure that looked like it belonged to a park ranger or Forest Service employee. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and through the windows we could see the comfortable glow of what appeared to be a normal domestic interior. Michael knocked on the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then we heard footsteps approaching from inside, and the door opened to reveal a middle-aged man in flannel and jeans. He had kind eyes and a graying beard, and he looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for the role of helpful mountain hermit. "Good Lord," he said, taking in our disheveled appearance and Jennifer's obvious injury. "What happened to you folks?" "We're lost," Michael said. "Our friend hurt her ankle, and we need help." The man, he introduced himself as Tom Harrison, ushered us inside without hesitation. The cabin's interior was exactly what we had hoped for. Rustic, but comfortable, with a stone fireplace crackling cheerfully and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Tom immediately began tending to Jennifer's ankle, revealing that he had some medical training from his time in the military. "You're lucky you found me," he said as he wrapped Jennifer's ankle in an elastic bandage from a well-stocked first aid kit. "I'm probably the only permanent resident within 20 miles of here. Been living off-grid for about 10 years now." "Off-grid?" Amanda asked. "No electricity, no phone lines, no connection to the outside world. Just me in the mountains." He finished with Jennifer's ankle and stood up. "But I do have a radio that can reach the ranger station. We'll get you folks evacuated first thing in the morning." Relief flooded through me like a physical sensation. We were safe. Tom offered us the use of his couch and floor space for the night, along with hot coffee and sandwiches, the first real food we'd had since leaving civilization. For the first time in what felt like days, I began to relax. It was only as I was settling down in my borrowed sleeping bag that I noticed the photographs. They covered one wall of the cabin's main room, dozens of snapshots that appeared to document Tom's solitary life in the mountains. Most showed him engaged in typical outdoor activities: fishing, hunting, chopping wood. But mixed in among the innocent images were others that made my blood run cold. Pictures of hikers. Not posed photos of willing subjects, but candid shots taken from a distance, as if Tom had been watching them without their knowledge. I recognized some of the faces from missing person flyers I had seen at the visitor center. In several of the photos, the hikers appeared to be sleeping, unaware that they were being observed. And in the most recent pictures, mounted in a place of honor above the fireplace, were photos of us. They had been taken the night before, showing us sleeping in our tents. The images were crystal clear despite the darkness, shot with some kind of night vision equipment. In one particularly chilling photo, I could see myself lying in my sleeping bag while a shadow loomed over my tent. The same shadow I had seen but dismissed as a nightmare. I tried to keep my expression neutral as Tom emerged from the kitchen with another pot of coffee. But he must have noticed my attention on the wall, because his friendly demeanor suddenly shifted. "Interesting collection, isn't it?" he said, his voice taking on a different quality. Colder, more calculating. "I've been documenting visitors to my territory for quite some time." "Territory?" Michael asked, and I could hear the tension creeping into his voice. "These mountains belong to me now," Tom said, "or rather, to what I've become. I was like you once, a lost hiker who stumbled into something he didn't understand. But I was smart enough to embrace the change instead of fighting it." He began to move differently as he spoke, his gait becoming fluid and predatory. In the firelight, his features seemed to shift and blur, taking on characteristics that weren't quite human. "You see," he continued, "the old legends got it wrong. Skinwalkers aren't born from murder, they're born from hunger. The hunger to become something more than human, something free from human limitations. And the mountains are hungry too. They call to certain people, offer them a choice." Jennifer had gone completely white. "You're insane." "Am I?" Tom laughed, and the sound contained harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "Look around you. You've been walking in circles for 2 days, haven't you? Time moving strangely, electronics failing, the landscape shifting when you're not looking directly at it. That's not insanity. That's transformation. The mountains are testing you, seeing if you're worthy. As he spoke, I noticed that the windows of the cabin no longer showed the warm interior light that had drawn us here. Instead, they reflected only darkness. Not the darkness of night, but the absolute absence of light that exists in the deepest caves. "The others," Amanda whispered, "those things around the fire." "My family," Tom said proudly. "Hikers who chose wisely, who accepted what was offered to them instead of clinging to their limited human existence. They're waiting for you to join them." "And if we refuse?" Brian asked. Tom's smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. "There is no refusal. The mountains have already marked you. You felt it, didn't you? The whispers in the dark, the sense of being watched, the way reality keeps shifting around the edges. That's the change beginning. You can embrace it willingly and retain some small portion of your consciousness, or you can fight it and become nothing more than hungry shadows." As if summoned by his words, shapes began to move outside the windows. The things from the fire had found us, and they pressed their distorted faces against the glass, leaving smears that looked disturbingly like blood. "Choose quickly," Tom said. "Dawn is coming, and the transformation is strongest in the hours before sunrise." But even as he spoke, Jennifer was reaching into her pack with her good hand. She pulled out something small and metallic, a flare gun that she had insisted on bringing despite our protests about unnecessary weight. "Get down," she shouted and fired. The flare exploded against Tom's chest in a burst of brilliant red light. He screamed, a sound that was part human agony and part animal rage, and his carefully maintained human appearance finally collapsed entirely. What stood before us was something that might have been human once, but had been reshaped by forces that operated outside natural law. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent in impossible directions, and its face was a shifting mass of features that couldn't seem to settle on a single configuration. The things outside the windows began to wail in sympathy, their voices rising to a pitch that made the cabin's windows vibrate. But Jennifer's flare had given us something Tom hadn't counted on. Light. Real light. Not the false illumination that had lured us here, but honest fire that cast harsh shadows and revealed truth. In its glow, we could see that the cabin was nothing more than a ruin. Collapsed walls, a caved-in roof, and furniture that had rotted away decades ago. We had been talking to empty air, seeing what the thing that called itself Tom wanted us to see. "The radio!" Michael shouted over the inhuman screaming. "Where's the radio?" But there was no radio, just as there had never been a working cabin. We were standing in the middle of a clearing, exposed to whatever lurked in the darkness beyond the flare's reach. "This way," Brian yelled, pointing toward what appeared to be a gap in the tree line. "I can see stars." Supporting Jennifer between us, we stumbled toward the opening as the flare began to die. Behind us, the thing that had been Tom was recovering from its burns, its form shifting and flowing like water as it prepared to give chase. We broke through the tree line just as the flare guttered out, plunging us back into darkness. But ahead of us, impossibly, was a sight that filled me with more relief than I had ever thought possible. The parallel lines of a two-lane highway, complete with reflective lane markers and guardrails. A pair of headlights was approaching from the south. "Help!" Amanda screamed, waving her arms frantically. "Help us!" The vehicle, a pickup truck with North Carolina State Park Service markings, pulled over immediately. The driver was Earl, the ranger who had tried to warn us 3 days earlier. "Jesus Christ," he said, taking in our appearance. "What happened to you folks?" As he helped us into the truck, I looked back at the forest we had just escaped. For just a moment, I thought I could see shapes moving among the trees. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to be made of shadow and malice. But then Earl's headlights swept across the tree line, and there was nothing there but ordinary forest. "We need to get to a hospital," Michael said. "Jennifer's ankle." "Hospital's 40 minutes away," Earl replied, already radioing for an ambulance to meet us. "You've been missing for 3 days. We had search teams out looking for you." 3 days. But that was impossible. We had only been in the forest for 2 nights. "What's the date?" I asked. Earl glanced at his dashboard clock. "October 15th, about 3 in the morning." We had entered the forest on October 12th. Somehow, we had lost an entire day. The rest of the night passed in a blur of hospital rooms and police interviews. Jennifer's ankle was indeed broken, but the doctors said it would heal completely. The rest of us were treated for dehydration, exhaustion, and various cuts and scrapes. Physically, we would all recover. Psychologically was another matter entirely. The official report classified our experience as a case of mass hysteria, brought on by stress, dehydration, and the disorienting effects of being lost in unfamiliar terrain. The investigators found no evidence of the cabin we described, no trace of the grotesque display we had discovered, no signs of the inhuman figures that had pursued us through the forest. But they did find something. Deep in the Boone Fork Wilderness area, in a small clearing beside a stagnant pool, search teams discovered the remains of 17 missing hikers. The bodies had been arranged in a circle around what appeared to be the remnants of an ancient fire pit, and all showed signs of having been altered. The official cause of death was listed as predation by unknown animals, but I saw some of the crime scene photos during our interviews. No animal had done those things. The investigation was quietly closed after 2 weeks, and the area was permanently removed from public access. Official explanations cited dangerous geological instability and toxic plant growth. But Earl confided to me later that the real reason was the search teams themselves. "Lost 2 more people," he said. "Experienced trackers who knew those woods like their own backyard. Went in to map the area for the investigation and just vanished. We found their equipment 3 days later, arranged in a neat pile like someone had unpacked it deliberately. But the gear was wrong somehow. Looked like their stuff, but when we tested it, the materials didn't match anything in their inventories." He paused, studying my face carefully. "You know what you saw out there, don't you?" I nodded. "Then you understand why we can't let anyone else go back. Whatever's in those mountains, it's getting stronger. And hungrier." 6 months have passed since our escape from Grandfather Mountain. Jennifer's ankle healed, though she still limps when it's going to rain. Michael has thrown himself into his work with obsessive intensity, as if staying busy can prevent him from thinking about what we experienced. Brian moved to Florida, as far from the mountains as he could get while remaining on the East Coast. Amanda quit her job and became a travel blogger, though she never writes about hiking or camping. As for me, I've become something of an expert on disappearances in the Appalachian Mountains. It's a disturbing hobby, but one I can't seem to abandon. The patterns are there if you know how to look for them. Groups of hikers who vanish for days before stumbling out of the forest with no memory of where they've been. Equipment found arranged in impossible configurations. Search teams reporting electronic failures and time distortions. And always the reports of things in the forest that don't quite match any known animal. The disappearances are increasing. Last month, a family of 4 went missing near Mount Mitchell. They were found a week later by other hikers, walking in a perfect line along a remote trail. When questioned, they claimed to have no memory of being lost and insisted they had only been hiking for a few hours. But their camping equipment told a different story. Gear that had somehow aged years in a matter of days. Food that had rotted completely, and photographs on their digital camera showing places that don't appear on any map. The family seemed normal at first, but the hikers who found them reported something disturbing. They never blinked. Not once during the entire encounter. I've been having dreams lately. Dreams of vast forests that stretch beyond the horizon, of mountains that shift and change when observed from different angles, and of figures that might once have been human calling to me from the darkness between the trees. In these dreams, I'm walking toward them, and with each step, I can feel something inside me changing, becoming something that no longer needs the comfortable limitations of human existence. I wake from these dreams with the taste of copper in my mouth, and the absolute certainty that something is waiting for me to return to the mountains. Earl calls me sometimes, usually late at night when he's had too much to drink and the weight of keeping secrets has become too heavy to bear alone. He tells me about the new disappearances, about the equipment his teams find that defies rational explanation, about the sounds that echo through the valleys on windless nights. "It's spreading," he said during his last call. "Whatever's up there, it's not content to stay in the deep wilderness anymore. We're getting reports from areas that used to be completely safe, popular day hikes, family campgrounds, places that have never had so much as a lost child before." He paused, and I could hear him taking a drink. "Sometimes I think about what you went through up there, and I wonder, how do we know you really escaped? How do we know that what came back down the mountain was still completely human?" I hung up without answering, but his question has been haunting me ever since, because lately I've been noticing things about myself that I can't explain. My night vision has improved dramatically. I can see clearly in darkness that used to leave me stumbling blind. I've developed an uncanny ability to navigate in unfamiliar terrain, as if some internal compass is guiding my steps. And when I look in the mirror, sometimes, just for a split second, my reflection seems slightly off, as if the proportions are subtly wrong or the angles of my face don't quite match what they should be. But most disturbing of all are the moments when I catch myself listening to whispers that no one else can hear, voices calling from the direction of the mountains, promising me that if I just return to the forest, all my questions will be answered. The truth is, I don't think we escaped at all. I think we were allowed to leave. And now, as autumn returns to North Carolina and the mountains begin their annual display of dying colors, I can feel the pull growing stronger. My friends have noticed it too, the way I stare northward during our rare get-togethers, the way I've started planning elaborate hiking trips that I never quite take, the way I sometimes speak of the forest as if it were a living thing. Last week, I bought a new backpack and sleeping bag. I told myself it was for day hikes on safe, well-marked trails, but deep down, I know the truth. The mountains are calling me home, and despite everything, despite the horror of what I witnessed, despite the knowledge of what waits in the darkness between the trees, part of me wants to answer that call. Because in my dreams, the figures in the forest aren't terrifying anymore. They're welcoming, and they're waiting for me to join them in their eternal dance around fires that burn with light stolen from the spaces between stars, in a place where the old laws of reality no longer apply, and where the hunger that gnaws at the heart of all wild things can finally be satisfied. The mountains remember everyone who has ever walked their trails, and they never forget to call them home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Grandfather Mountain, North Carolina, during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day hiking trip with my two closest friends. David Jones and Christopher Hernandez had been my college roommates, and even though we'd all moved to different cities after graduation, we made it a point to meet up every year for a hiking adventure. This year, Chris had suggested the Tanawa Trail near Grandfather Mountain, a supposedly moderate hike through some of North Carolina's most pristine wilderness. What drew him to this particular location was the isolation. According to his research, we could go days without seeing another soul on the more remote sections of the trail. I should have paid more attention to why Chris was so insistent on finding the most isolated spot possible. The first sign something was wrong came before we even started hiking. We'd driven up from Charlotte on a Friday afternoon, planning to start our trek Saturday morning. The GPS had worked fine until we reached the gravel access road leading to the trailhead. That's when it started glitching. The screen would flicker, lose signal, then show us in completely different locations. David, ever the pragmatist, blamed it on the mountain terrain interfering with the satellite signal. Chris just laughed and said it would make the adventure more authentic. But I noticed something in Chris's laugh that I'd never heard before, a hollow quality that made my skin crawl. We parked at what we thought was the correct trailhead, though the wooden sign was so weathered and moss-covered that the trail name was illegible. The forest felt different here, older somehow. The trees grew so thick that even in the late afternoon light, shadows pooled between their trunks like spilled ink. The air smelled of decomposition and something else, something metallic that reminded me of blood. "You guys feel that?" David asked as we shouldered our packs. He was a big guy, former college football player, not easily spooked, but his voice carried an edge I'd rarely heard. "Feel what?" Chris asked, but he was already walking toward the tree line, moving with an eagerness that seemed out of character. "It's just heavy here," David continued, adjusting his pack straps. "Like the air is thicker." I knew what he meant. It felt like breathing through wet wool, and there was a pressure behind my eyes that hadn't been there at the parking area. But Chris was already disappearing into the forest, so we followed. The trail was barely visible, just a faint depression in the leaf litter that wound deeper into the woods. Our phones showed no signal, which wasn't surprising, but the batteries were draining faster than they should have been. By the time we'd hiked for 2 hours, David's phone was completely dead, despite starting with a full charge. "Must be the cold," Chris said when David mentioned it, though the temperature was a comfortable 65 degrees. We made camp that first night in a small clearing beside what our map indicated was Boone Creek, though the water ran black and had an oily sheen that reflected the firelight in nauseating rainbows. Chris insisted on camping here, saying the sound of water would help us sleep. But the creek didn't make the normal babbling sounds of running water. Instead, it produced a low, rhythmic whispering that seemed almost like conversation in a language I couldn't understand. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the canopy, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The darkness between the trees was absolute, a black so complete it seemed to have weight and substance. Every time I closed my eyes, I could swear I heard footsteps circling our camp, but when I listened carefully, there was only that endless whispering from the creek. David was having trouble sleeping, too. I could hear him shifting restlessly in his bag, occasionally muttering under his breath. But Chris was perfectly still, breathing so quietly I had to strain to hear him at all. Around 3 in the morning, I was jolted awake by complete silence. The creek had stopped whispering. Even the usual forest sounds, insects, small animals rustling in the undergrowth, had ceased entirely. The silence was so profound it felt like being buried alive. That's when I heard Chris unzip his sleeping bag. In the dying light of our fire, I could see his silhouette sitting up, but he wasn't moving like someone who had just woken up. His movements were too fluid, too purposeful. He stood and walked to the edge of our campsite, stopping at the tree line where the darkness was deepest. "Chris," I whispered, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, perfectly motionless, facing the forest. I was about to get up and check on him when he spoke, but his voice sounded different, deeper, with an odd echo as if it were coming from much farther away. "Do you hear them calling?" he asked. Hear what?" I sat up in my bag, my heart racing, but Chris had already turned around, and in the faint glow of the embers I could see him smiling. It was a smile I'd never seen on his face before, too wide, stretching his lips thin, and his teeth seemed sharper somehow. "Nothing," he said in his normal voice, lying back down. "Just a weird dream." But I knew he hadn't been asleep. The next morning, Chris was back to his usual self, making jokes and complaining about the instant coffee. David seemed to have slept through the entire incident. When I mentioned Chris's middle-of-the-night wandering, David looked concerned, but Chris just laughed it off. "You must have been dreaming too," he said, but there was something in his eyes when he looked at me, something hungry, and knowing that made me want to put distance between us. We broke camp and continued deeper into the mountains. According to our map, we were supposed to intersect with another trail that would loop us back toward the parking area, but the landscape didn't match what was drawn on paper. The trail markers we did find were wrong, rusted metal tags with numbers that didn't correspond to anything in our guidebook. By midday, we were completely lost. "The map must be outdated," David said, studying the terrain around us. We'd stopped for lunch in another small clearing, this one dominated by a massive dead oak tree whose branches reached out like skeletal fingers. Chris was crouched beside the tree, running his hands over the bark. "Look at this," he called out. We joined him at the base of the oak. The bark was covered in strange markings. Not carvings exactly, but deep gouges that formed patterns. They looked like symbols, though not from any language I recognized. Some were filled with a dark, resinous substance that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Probably just bare scratches," David suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Chris traced one of the symbols with his finger, and I swear I saw it gleam for just a moment as if lit from within. "These aren't random," he said. "They're deliberate. Someone or something made these." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We should keep moving," I said. But Chris was transfixed by the markings. He'd taken out his phone and was photographing them, even though the device was supposedly dead. The screen glowed faintly as he worked, casting sick greenish light on his face. "How is your phone working?" David asked. Chris looked up, and for just a moment his eyes reflected the phone's light like an animal's. "Battery must have recharged somehow," he said, but he quickly put the device away. We hiked for another hour before David realized Chris was leading us in circles. We'd passed the same distinctive rock formation 3 times, each time approaching it from a different direction. When David pointed this out, Chris became agitated. "You're wrong," he snapped, his voice carrying an edge of something dangerous. "I know exactly where we are." "Then where are we?" I asked. Chris turned to look at me, and I noticed his pupils were dilated despite the bright afternoon light. "We're exactly where we need to be," he said. "That night, we made camp in what felt like the same clearing we'd used the night before, though that was impossible given how far we'd hiked. The same dead oak loomed over us, its symbol-scarred bark seeming to pulse in the firelight. The same black creek whispered its incomprehensible secrets nearby. David was getting nervous. He'd been trying to get his phone working all day, hoping to at least access the GPS function, but the device remained completely dead. "We need to think about heading back tomorrow," he said as we ate our freeze-dried dinners. "If we're this lost, we should retrace our steps." "We're not lost," Chris said calmly. "We're exploring." "Exploring what?" I asked. "We've been hiking in circles all day." Chris smiled that too wide smile again. In the firelight, his teeth definitely looked sharper. "Haven't you felt it?" he asked. "The forest is calling to us. It wants us to find something." "The forest isn't calling to anyone," David said firmly. "We're 3 guys with a GPS malfunction and an outdated map. That's it." Chris's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold fury that transformed his familiar features into something alien. "You don't understand," he said in a voice that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "This place is ancient. It was here long before the Cherokee, long before humans walked upright, and it's hungry." The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. Our fire guttered and flickered, the flames taking on an unnatural blue-green color. In the new light, Chris's face looked gaunt, his cheekbones more pronounced, his eye sockets deeper. "Chris, you're freaking us out," David said, but his voice was shaking. Chris tilted his head at an unnatural angle like a bird studying prey. "You should be afraid," he said. "The things that live in these woods, they've been sleeping for so long. But they're waking up now. They can smell you." I felt something cold crawl up my spine. In the strange light of our fire, Chris didn't look entirely human anymore. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth had definitely become more pointed. "What happened to you out there today?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Chris's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "I remembered what I really am," he said. That's when David started backing away from the fire. "Michael," he whispered, "we need to leave. Now." But Chris was faster than either of us had ever seen him move. One moment he was sitting across the fire from us. The next he was standing directly behind David, his impossibly long fingers resting on David's shoulders. "You're not going anywhere," Chris said, and his voice had become something between a whisper and a growl. "The forest needs to feed, and you're going to help." David tried to pull away, but Chris's grip was like iron. I could hear David's shoulder bones grinding under the pressure of those fingers. "Chris, let him go," I shouted, grabbing a burning branch from the fire. Chris looked at me with eyes that were no longer entirely human. They'd become yellow and reflective like a wolf's eyes. "That's not my name anymore," he said. "I am much older than that human shell. I am the hunger that walks between the trees. I am the winter that never ends." The thing that had been Chris opened its mouth, and I saw rows of needle-sharp teeth extending far back into its throat. A sound emerged that was part howl, part scream, a noise that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. David managed to break free and stumbled toward me, but I could see deep puncture wounds on his shoulders where Chris's fingers had been. The wounds were already turning black around the edges. "Run!" David gasped, but his legs were wobbling and I could see the infection, or whatever it was, spreading up his neck in dark veins. I grabbed David's arm and we stumbled away from the fire, crashing through the underbrush in the direction we thought led back to the trail. Behind us, that inhuman howling continued, joined by other voices answering from deeper in the forest. We ran blindly through the darkness, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. David was getting weaker by the minute, the black veins now visible on his cheeks and forehead. Whatever Chris had done to him was spreading fast. "Leave me," David wheezed after we'd been running for what felt like hours. "It's got me, Michael. You can see it, can't you?" I could see it. The darkness spreading under his skin, the way his eyes were starting to change color, becoming more yellow. Most disturbing of all, he was beginning to smile that same too wide smile. "I can fight it," he said, but his voice was already taking on that hollow quality I'd heard in Chris's laugh. "But not for long. You need to get out of here." "I'm not leaving you," I said, though every instinct was screaming at me to run. David grabbed my arm with fingers that felt too long and too strong. "Listen to me," he said, and for a moment his voice was entirely his own. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not just possessing us. It's changing us into something else, something that needs to feed on human flesh and fear." The pupils of his eyes had become vertical slits. "I can feel it in my head, Michael. It's showing me things. Terrible, wonderful things. It's showing me how good you're going to taste." I backed away from him, my hands shaking. "David, fight it. You're stronger than this." But David was laughing now, and the sound was exactly like Chris's broken glass laughter. "I don't want to fight it anymore," he said. "It feels so good to be hungry, so good to hunt." He lunged at me with inhuman speed, but I was ready. I swung the burning branch I'd grabbed from our camp, catching him across the face. The flames seemed to cause him real pain. He shrieked and fell back, clawing at his cheek where the fire had touched him. I ran. I crashed through the forest for hours, guided only by the faint light of dawn that was beginning to filter through the canopy. Everything looked the same. Endless trees, endless darkness between them. I was lost, exhausted, and beginning to hallucinate from fear and dehydration. That's when I heard them calling my name. "Michael!" It was David's voice, but somehow it came from multiple directions at once. "Michael, where are you? We're worried about you. Michael!" Now it was Chris's voice, but wrong somehow, as if it were being played backwards. "Come back to camp. We found the trail." I pressed myself against a large tree and tried to control my breathing. The voices were getting closer, and now there were more of them. Not just David and Chris, but other voices I didn't recognize. Men, women, even children, all calling my name in sing-song voices that made my skin crawl. "Michael Williams," said a voice that sounded like my mother, though she'd been dead for 5 years. "Come home, baby. Mommy's waiting." I bit down on my fist to keep from screaming. The voices surrounded me now, coming from every direction, a chorus of the familiar and the impossible. But underneath them all, I could hear something else, a low, rhythmic chanting in that same incomprehensible language I'd heard from the creek. Through the trees, I could see shapes moving. They walked upright like humans, but their proportions were all wrong. Too tall, with arms that hung too low and heads that sat at unnatural angles. In the growing light, I could see that their skin had that same grayish pallor Chris had developed, and their eyes glowed with that same yellow light. One of them was definitely Chris, though he was at least a foot taller than he'd been yesterday, and so thin he looked skeletal. Another might have been David, but his face had elongated into something almost canine, with a muzzle full of those needle teeth. They were hunting me, moving in a pattern that would gradually close off all my escape routes. But they were taking their time, savoring the fear they could probably smell on me. That's when I remembered something David had said before the change fully took him. Fire hurt them. These things, whatever they were vulnerable to flames. I still had my waterproof matches in my jacket pocket. The forest floor was covered in dry leaves and fallen branches. If I could create enough fire. I began gathering the driest material I could find, working as quietly as possible. The voices were getting closer, and I could hear footsteps now. Too many footsteps, moving in perfect coordination like a pack of wolves. "We can smell you, Michael," called a voice that might have been Chris. "We can taste your fear from here. Why are you making this so difficult?" I struck a match and held it to the pile of leaves I'd assembled. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the dry material caught, flames spreading quickly through the tinder. The effect was immediate. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by angry, hissing sounds. Through the smoke, I could see the shapes retreating, but they weren't going far. I fed more branches into my fire, building it as large as I dared. The creatures stayed just beyond the circle of light, their yellow eyes reflecting the flames. Now that I could see them clearly, I realized they weren't just Chris and David anymore. There were at least a dozen of them, all similar in their gaunt height and predatory posture. "Fire won't protect you forever," said the thing that had been Chris. Its voice carried clearly through the crackling flames. "And when it dies, we'll still be here. We'll always be here." I spent the day feeding my fire and trying to figure out how to escape. The creatures maintained their vigil just beyond the light, occasionally calling out in voices of people I'd known. Friends, family members, even my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson. They were trying to lure me away from the flames with familiar voices and false promises of safety. As the sun began to set again, I realized my pile of fuel was running low. I'd have to make a decision soon. Try to make a run for it in the darkness, or stay and fight when the fire inevitably died. That's when I heard the helicopter. It was faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of my fire, but it was definitely getting closer, the rhythmic thump of rotors cutting through the forest silence. The creatures heard it too. They'd gone completely still, their heads tilted upward like animals sensing a predator. I grabbed a burning branch and started waving it over my head, hoping the pilot might see the smoke from my fire. The helicopter sound grew louder, and I could see lights sweeping through the canopy above me. The creatures began to retreat deeper into the forest, but they didn't go far. They knew the helicopter couldn't land in the thick woods, and they were prepared to wait. But the helicopter didn't leave. It circled overhead for several minutes, and then I heard a new sound, someone rappelling down through the trees. A figure in rescue gear dropped into my clearing, followed quickly by two others. "Michael Williams," called the first rescuer, a woman with a Park Service patch on her jacket. "Your friends called in a search and rescue when you didn't return yesterday." "My friends?" I asked, confused. "My friends are—" I gestured toward the forest where the creatures had been waiting, but the yellow eyes had vanished. "David Jones and Christopher Hernandez," the rescuer continued. "They hiked out yesterday morning and reported you missing. Said you'd gotten separated during the night and they couldn't find you." My blood went cold. "They hiked out?" "That's right. They're waiting for you at the ranger station." Pretty worried about you, actually." I looked around the clearing where I'd spent the day fighting for my life. In the harsh light of the rescuers' spotlights, it looked like an ordinary patch of forest. There were no signs of my struggle, no evidence of the creatures that had stalked me. "Are you injured?" asked one of the other rescuers, a man who was examining my torn clothes and scratched face. I don't think so," I said, though my mind was reeling. How had David and Chris gotten out? When had they changed back? Or had they ever changed at all? The helicopter extraction was surreal. As we rose above the forest canopy, I looked down at the trees that had been my prison for 2 days. From above, it looked peaceful, just another stretch of North Carolina wilderness. There was no sign of the clearing where we'd camped, no trace of the dead oak with its strange symbols. At the ranger station, David and Chris were waiting for me with expressions of relief and concern that looked completely genuine. They rushed over as soon as they saw me, and their touch felt normal. Warm, human skin, familiar voices with no hollow echo. "Jesus, Michael, we were terrified," David said, gripping my shoulder with fingers that felt perfectly normal. No sign of the black veins or yellowing eyes. "What happened out there?" Chris asked. "You just vanished in the middle of the night. We looked everywhere for you." I stared at them, searching for any sign of the creatures they'd become, but they looked exactly like themselves. Tired, worried, entirely human. "You don't remember?" I asked carefully. "Remember what?" Chris looked genuinely confused. "We woke up and you were gone. Found your sleeping bag torn open from the inside, like you'd left in a hurry. We figured you'd gotten disoriented and wandered off." David nodded. "We searched for hours before deciding to hike out and get help. Chris thought he heard you calling from deeper in the woods, but when we followed the sound, we just got more lost." The ranger who'd rescued me was taking notes on a clipboard. "This happens more often than you'd think," she said. "The terrain out there can be disorienting, especially at night. People get turned around, start seeing and hearing things that aren't there." "Seeing things?" I asked. "Stress, dehydration, lack of sleep," she explained. "Your mind starts playing tricks on you. Some folks report seeing monsters, hearing voices of dead relatives, all kinds of things. The important thing is you're safe now." But as we drove away from Grandfather Mountain, I caught Chris watching me in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, his eyes reflected the dashboard lights like an animal's, and his smile was a fraction too wide. When I got home, I tried to research what might have happened to us out there. I found references to old Cherokee legends about Wendigo-like creatures that lived in the deepest parts of the Appalachian forests. Beings that could mimic human voices and appearance, that fed on human flesh and grew stronger with each person they consumed. According to the legends, these creatures could take over human hosts, wearing their bodies like masks while the original soul was trapped inside, screaming. The only way to tell if someone had been taken was to watch for subtle changes. Eyes that reflected light, smiles that stretched too far, movements that were just a little too fluid to be entirely human. But the legends also said the creatures couldn't maintain the illusion perfectly. Eventually, the hunger would show through, and they would need to feed again. It's been 3 months since our hiking trip, and David and Chris have been acting completely normal. We've had dinner together, watched football games, even planned another camping trip for next spring. They seem like themselves in every way that matters, except for small things. The way Chris's eyes sometimes catch the light wrong. How David's laugh occasionally has that hollow quality I remember from that night by the fire. The fact that neither of them seems to remember anything about the second day of our trip, the day we got lost, the strange markings on the oak tree, the moment when everything went wrong. And there's something else. Something I discovered when I developed the photos from Chris's supposedly dead camera. The last picture on the roll shows the 3 of us around our campfire on the first night. We're all smiling at the camera, looking like 3 friends having a great time in the wilderness. But in the photo, standing just behind us in the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, are 3 tall, gaunt figures with glowing eyes and 2 wide smiles. They're watching us with an expression of such hunger and anticipation that my hands shake every time I look at the image. I've never shown this photo to David or Chris. I'm not sure I want to know what they'd say about it. Sometimes I catch them watching me when they think I'm not looking, and I wonder if they're waiting for something. If they're biding their time until they can lead me back into those woods, back to that place where the trees whisper secrets and the darkness has teeth. Next month, Chris called to suggest we try a different trail. Somewhere even more remote, he said. Somewhere we can really get away from civilization. I told him I'd think about it, but I've already started looking at plane tickets to other states, places far from North Carolina, far from mountains and deep woods. I've been thinking about cities, about places where there's always light and noise and crowds of people, because late at night when the house is quiet and dark, I sometimes hear them calling my name. David's voice from the basement, Chris's laughter from the attic, and underneath it all, that incomprehensible whispering I first heard beside the Black Creek. They sound hungry, and they sound close.